Alrighty. What's going on, folks? Let me make sure I'm good here. Sorry for the delay. I had to get things right. But welcome once again, another edition of Boxing History Every Night. Or at least that's the name I've given it right now. But excited to be here. Great discussion here tonight that we're going to have. I feel like it's been a while representing 86 Boxing here, of course. But feels good. Feels good for sure. Got my phone here. If you hit me up, you know I'm live, baby. What's going on, folks? Do we have any boxing history fans in here? I see one person right now. Hey, I'm cool with one person. If one person's in, then I'm down with that. But I know that there may be more that ultimately tune in. And with that in mind, certainly I want to send my salutes for sure. Send my salutes. Shout out to my man, Dan, a.k.a. Dan the man. Says salute, Big Bear. Salute to you there, Dan. That you here always, as always. And what do you know? We have a man, Miter, in the building, the Miter Span man. Hey, give him a follow there. Gaming content. Appreciate you, Miter. Been here for a long time, a very, very long time, Miter. I would say day one, or at least day one since started making videos on the history of the sport, that is. Appreciate you, Miter. Good to have you here, no doubt about it. But man, random acoustic thoughts. Random. I had to send you something. I know you might be on your way to doing some things, but hey, if you want to hop on here for a little bit random, then we can make it happen for sure. Just let me know, buddy. Just let me know. But we're talking about the great C.C. Smith tonight. C.C. Smith. Miter says he's currently at work, but I saw this pop up and just wanted to give him my regards. Regards to you there, Miter. Regards. Pleasure to have you here. It's an honor to have you here. As a matter of fact, there, Miter. Certainly, it's an honor to have you here. Glad to see you still doing your thing, brother. Hey, likewise, buddy. Likewise. Got to get you on here at some point. Remember, we talked about collaborating on something. Hey, I haven't forgot about that. Have some things in the work. I'll have to shoot you an email there, Miter. We can make something happen for sure. We can certainly make something happen. Random seems to be down, and that's a good thing. Random down with the cause. I'm good with that, of course. Peace from Miter. Good stuff. Emberly Grace. Hello, Emberly. What's going on, man? Emberly. Hey, appreciate you being here, holding it down from Twitch. That's good stuff right there. Good stuff for sure. Salute, people. Hey, just happy to be here. As mentioned, hey, we're going to make some things happen. The Boz in here says, here I am. Hey, what's going on with you? The Boz, of course. Always a pleasure to have you in the mix here, Boz, the Bozinator, as we often say. So appreciate you for sure. Appreciate you. Hey, it's all love here. It's all love. Appreciate that. Miter. Hey, Miter, getting respect from the Boz. Miter says, yes, sir. Let's do it. Hey, I'm going to hit you off for real, Miter. I'm hitting you up for real. You see it? And we're here on the same page. No doubt about it. Long time no see, says the Boz. You're really doing great. Hey, appreciate you, Emberly. Salute to you, Emberly. Hey, I got to check you out there, Emberly. I appreciate you dropping by. No doubt about it. So yeah, it's a good thing. You know, another night here, Monday night. Why not talk boxing history? We don't get Monday night fights like we did back in the day. So history is always available. All you have to do is seek it out. I seek it out myself personally. I know a lot of people on here seek it out. And when you dive through the history of boxing, you learn a lot of things. That's the best way to sum it up. You learn something, you know? I know we all have our own predictions, our own thoughts. We have what we see here today from an eye-to-eye standpoint, I guess you can say, what comes on the television, what we can see on our phones, YouTube, etc. A lot of content out here. A lot of content. And of course, the modern stuff, we can get it real time. So you're never shy of any updates because you know what's happening when it happens. Everyone's looking to break that next thing. But that being said, when you dive into the history, you learn a little something. I've learned something. I wasn't always diving into history, I would say. And I didn't know much. You could argue I still don't know much now. But that being said, I've learned something. I've learned something about the sport of boxing, how it operates, why it's where it is now, why it refuses to die. You know, boxing's been dead for a long time, It's been dead for a long time, but it refuses to die off completely, but it's been dead for a long time. Many have mentioned and even predicted the downfall. But that being said, it's still around. And one reason that is the case is because there were many fighters in the past who laid the foundation, and those roots, you got to dig deep if you're trying to get rid of those. That's tough right there. You know how trees work. It's hard to get to those roots. You got to have the right machinery. You got to dig deep. So boxing's going to be here, baby. I'm telling you, boxing is going to be here. It's going to be around. And as long as we're talking about what's gone down in the sport, regardless of where it lies in the future, there's always something to learn. And tonight we're going to learn about a fighter who doesn't have a huge name, depending on who you talk to, of course, but he doesn't have a huge name. He has a huge name in the eyes of yours truly, and I know some people in this chat for sure, and that's Charles Smith. Charles A.C. Smith. C.C. Smith. There are a bunch of Smiths out there. You know, almost common name, right? Charles Smith. That's a very common type name, right? We know a lot of Charles. We know a lot of Smiths. As a matter of fact, I bet everyone probably knows someone with the last name Smith, someone with the first name Charles. I bet if I ask, everyone knows someone with that name right there. Boz in the gym for the first time in 3 years. Salute to you, Boz. I went in there yesterday, like I told you. I went in there. I skipped today. You know, we had a discussion to talk about boxing history. And the boss says, now let's find out who Sugar Ray Robinson ducked. Ha ha, you're very funny there. You're very funny there, Boz. Oh, you're going to start some stuff right here with these claims of duck. You're going to start some stuff for sure. You're going to start some stuff. Emery says you should probably run a Twitch video campaign to generate more followers. Cool, Emery. Cool, Emery. Hey, I'll look into it. I hold it down on YouTube primarily, so I'm good over here. My people are over here. We're in there. Nice analogy. I appreciate you there, Boz. Appreciate you. Appreciate you. They call Paul Smith. He's mega. Good stuff. But Emily, gonna look into it for sure. Definitely gonna get to that Twitch and all that good stuff. But for the time being, we're talking about Charles A.C. Smith. And man, he is a prominent heavyweight in history. You have to know that. If you don't know of boxing history to that degree, especially the heavyweight history, you're in the place to be. Charles A.C. Smith, born in Macon, Georgia. Of course, he came to in the late 1800s. I know you're a fan of that, right? But we love the late 1800s, all those time frames in or around there. Here where we're at. But that being said, Charles A.C. Smith came to in the late 1800s. As a matter of fact, when you really dive into him, you realize that he was a force. He was a force. Of course, I mentioned the first colored world heavyweight champion. I mentioned that off top. And that is true. That's very much true. The first colored world heavyweight champion. Now, what does that mean, of course? What does being the first colored world heavyweight champion mean? He was the first to put out a claim for such. And how that works is when you establish a claim, they're usually picked up by the media and all. I'm shooting you this random. I'm shooting you this. When you put out a claim, they're usually established by media. If you think about the World Heavyweight Championship, it was established by media, so on and so forth. Because if you don't know, then you don't know. And that's essentially how things have ultimately come about over the course of time. Salute to my man Flack Boxing in here. Be sure to check him out. Subscribe to Flack Boxing. Oh yeah, subscribe to the Boz as well, dropping stuff. But Flack Boxing indeed, young historian there, as you can say. Flack knows the deal right there. So salute to you, Flack. Appreciate you being here. But anyway. Claims were established through media for the most part. So Charles A.C. Smith, he established a claim to the World Colored Heavyweight Championship in 1876. He's the first recognized World Heavyweight Champion because of such. And ultimately, he ended up having backing from the National Police Gazette, which we'll dive into a bit more. They had an actual medal that was provided and presented to the challengers. And you think about the World Heavyweight Championship, no different. The only difference there is Charles A.C. Smith or Charles Smith, C.C. Smith. He never got to fight for such. But that aside, that's how those claims are generally established. Real quick, while I have it here, I want to shout out to Mark Allen Baker, and Arthur right here. He's going to be coming on for an interview. So look forward to it. True historian of the sport right here. He works with the International Boxing Hall of Fame. He's an International Boxing Hall of Famer. He's going to be coming on at some point here in October. Look, check the schedule there on the YouTube, but October 18th to be specific. Same time, same place. Mark Allen Baker. This is a book with a lot of information right here. The World Colored Heavyweight Championship, 1876. 1876 because of who? Charles Smith. Now, and through 1937. But I just want to say, Mark Allen Baker did a good job of establishing where things started and kind of where it went. And I learned something from reading this particular book that has helped me realize that Charles A.C. Smith, that is, yeah, he was a very interesting guy. As a matter of fact, there were a number of other Charles Smiths that were running around as well. Something I didn't know. It's pretty crazy to think about such. Some other Charles Smiths running around under the same namesake, but it had to do with a promotional type situation. And I guess for a running show or a running promotion, they were taking the approach of, hey, regardless of who the actual fighter is, we're going to have Charles Smith and we're just going to run with them. So when the original Charles Smith said he was done, they kept going with things and they kept lining up new Charles Smiths. Essentially, I could account for three of them or something of that nature in this book. But we'll talk about it a bit more with Mark Allen Baker when he gets on the actual podcast here October 18th. So definitely looking forward to that one. Very interesting stuff. But Charles A.C. Smith, a.k.a. C.C. Smith, a very interesting character overall. As I mentioned, he's from Macon, Georgia. Of all places, Georgia, they have some pretty solid boxers that have come through. So C.C. Smith is no different. One of those boxers from Georgia. And, hey, much respect to him. Much respect to C.C. Smith. So I want to show you something here. It kind of gives you a view of what his record was. C.C. Smith, 40 wins, 14 losses, 5 draws, no decisions, at least known right now, and 7 no contests. Macon, Georgia, U.S. of A. is where he's actually from, as I mentioned previously. And he is one of those individuals that you should know of. If you didn't know of him, you're about to know about him now. But he built up that record by virtue of fighting, and it's estimated that he had over 200 fights realistically in his career. Over 200 fights. So he's a guy who fought with gloves and without gloves. And generally, if you started in the time frames of the 1870s, which he did, then in all likelihood, at some point in time, you probably did get out there and exchange a few blows without gloves on. And it was just the norm for the time, actually. Just a norm for the time. London prize ring rules, they were well established, which is essentially bare-knuckle rules. There are some slight differences. London prize ring rules, of course, ties to London logically. That being said, bare knuckle, that's the way it went down. I've explained it before. There were a lot of things that were allowed under those rules that weren't necessarily allowed in what we know today as the sport of boxing. But, it is what it is. That's kind of just how it was for that time. But that being said, C.C. Smith, he was a man who established both. 40 of those wins, or in those 40 wins, 32 of them were via knockout. So just wanted to point that out. So you can see from there, from a record standpoint, he was no slouch. So we'll dive into who he was in with. 40 of those victories, they had to come over someone, but also we know that he took 14 losses. And of course, when it comes to losses, I've said it once and I'll say it again. All wins and losses are not created equal. I repeat, all wins and losses are not created equal. So with that in mind, it's one of those situations for sure. It's one of those situations where, hey, you never know what could happen in the sport, and we'll kind of see how some of those licenses or those losses, that is, came about. It's just one of those situations. Now, Charles A.C. Smith again, C.C. Smith, that is. Real quick, let me dive into these comments because they can get out of hand really quick. So salute to my man, Bruce Gas, Boxing, Jazz, and more. Salute. He sends, hey, check out Bruce Gas if you're into the content of boxing, whether that's history and what's going on now, but just want to have a good time in general. Check out Bruce Gas, Boxing, Jazz, and more. He is legitly the truth there. Always a good time over there on Bruce's channel. Dan says, quick Arthur Bakar, I'm looking forward to. Good stuff there. By 1876, I believe Jack London was born there from the Boz. Okay, Jack London. We know him as a writer, journalist, whatever you may call it. But that's good stuff right there. Yeah, he was indeed a big boxing fan. Shout out to my man, Joseph Phoenix. Joseph Phoenix in the building. Hey, a scholar there in the sport of boxing. Check out the comments. You'll see some great stuff coming from Joseph Phoenix, who says, excellent episode. Appreciate you, Joseph. As always, I try to say that all the time. I try to when I can. Now, good stuff there. Dan says he's from the same hometown as Flack, Binghamton. Okay, good stuff there, Dan. Good stuff. We got some other salutes there. Flack Boxing says that's not my hometown. Binghamton is about an hour away. Okay. We're getting facts set straight here. Joseph Phoenix says, wonder why Smith never fought the great Peter Jackson. That is an interesting one. Well, based on diving into this book from Mark Allen Baker, I think it ended up being a situation that maybe when Peter was sort of at his height, C.C. Smith wasn't necessarily in that same boxing mood or phase, I would say. He had started to dial things back a little bit. And that's according to what I've been able to gather. And he took some losses here and there, but it could have been that. I don't know. It's one of those things. But that would have been a very interesting one. And I think it would have solved a lot of questions as it relates to the two, because many don't know much about C.C. Smith. We do know a bit more detail about Jackson, who is from Australia. Interesting how that works, right? So that's a good question there, Phoenix. But exactly why it happened, I might have to, I have to dive in, or why it didn't happen, I have to dive into that a bit more myself. But I'm thinking timing and the trajectory from a career standpoint is probably the reason. But that being said, that would have been an interesting one for sure. Dan says, C.C. Smith, great fighter in the toughest era. Yeah, that era was legit. It was a legit era. Many mentioned the 70s, etc., as far as heavyweights, 90s, so on and so forth. But this era was indeed tough. And Dan, I know we have little chats or sidebar comment discussions about it all the time. But Australia, they produced a number of great heavyweights during that period, which we don't often see here these days as far as Australian heavyweights, though we did have one who fought not too long ago against Filip Hrgovic. He lost, but that being said, not many prominent ones the way it was back then. So it's interesting. The boss says CC Fly would have been a good nickname for him. Which is, yeah, that could have worked. Flag Boxing, says the Peter Jackson live was great. We should do another. Indeed, we should. Someone else, I think it was Mark, asked about such. We should do another one. We can dive into that, Flack. We'd love to have you on as we make that discussion, no doubt about it. Joseph Phoenix says Larry Holmes and Edward Charles, both great from Georgia. Vernon Forrest also from Augusta. Oh, yeah, Vernon. Yeah, he is from Georgia. Yep, that is right. He is from Georgia. Larry Holmes, Edward Charles. We're talking about some legendary fighters in the grand scheme of things when you really boil it down. Dan says only one loss in first 6 years. Yes, crazy, crazy. Now the fight that, of course, the Peter Jackson fight didn't happen, but the fight that should have happened was C.C. Smith versus John L. Sullivan. That's the fight that should have happened. Ed Charles was from Cincinnati. Not, oh yeah, I knew him as a Cincinnati Cobra. That is a good question right there, Boz. But yeah, he was born in Georgia. Hey, we get it right here. Black, thanks for that. Okay, like Jimmy Bivens. Yeah, the Cleveland Spider-Man, Jimmy Bivens. Someone I wanted to do a video on right there. But yeah, this is interesting stuff right here. Interesting stuff. Let me see. Flex says Georgia was home of some legends, many great fighters. No doubt about it. I believe Smoking Joe's parents from Georgia too. I know he was from a different state. I believe they may have been Georgia, South Carolina. I think is where Joe has ties to in some sense. Maybe he was born there, but I know he has ties to South Carolina. Bruce Gas in the building, but yeah, hey, great. Caught up with all the comments. Thank you. Larry is from Memphis or born there. Okay, good. You know how it goes in the sport of boxing. Things get a little bit crazy as it relates to such. It's just one of those things. But we'll see. We'll see what happens. But C.C. Smith, as I mentioned, excellent fighter who just came to in a time where he wasn't able to get a world heavyweight title shot. But as we dive into it, you'll see that he actually made some great strides in what he was able to do in his career as a whole. And that's got to count for something. And as we dive a bit more into it, I think a lot will be revealed. Joe Frazier from Beaufort, South Carolina. Joseph Phoenix, spot on there. I told you, Joseph knows what's going on in the world of boxing history, without a doubt. Beaufort, salute the Boz. Yep, you are spot on as well. But yeah, South Carolina, but that's good stuff indeed. So we're going to dive a little bit more into C.C. Smith. And as we get ready to do that, I'm going to bring in my man, Random Acoustic Thoughts. Random, what is going on with your buddy here to talk about some C.C. Smith? And of course, you got Langford there in the profile. That would have been an interesting one. But how's it going with you, buddy?
Everything's good on my end. How you doing, brother?
Hey, all is great. All is great. Just trying to make sure that I stay level and keep diving into this history. I know you're out there doing your thing, been in the books, all that good stuff.
Yeah, unfortunately, two things unfortunate. I only have a couple seconds to talk. And also, I actually have the book. I bought Mark Allen Baker's The World Colored Heavyweight Championship, 1876 to 37. Yeah, you see, you got it too, but I haven't read it yet.
Oh, okay.
I haven't had a chance because I also recently got Colleen Aycock, and I forget her co-author's name. Forgive me, but they're excellent book on Joe Gans, on the great Joe Gans, and so I'm reading it and also researching. I've been assembling Sam Langford's booking schedule for 1903, so not just and 1902, so not just there were probably 8 or 9 bookings that were either canceled or substituted for a different fighter. And it's helping me piece together his thing. So, like, for instance, and I'm just going to be brief because I know this is about C.C. Smith, one of the Charles Smiths. But, so like Jay Johnson, who won the amateur at 145 in 02 at the Roanoke the same night that Langford won at 135, they fought the next year, but they were actually supposed to rematch a few weeks after that. And it was changed. And I think it became, I think it might have become Johnny Butler. I can't remember who it became, but so I'm actually assembling like everything that the newspapers said was coming together, including potential matchups like with Honey Melody. Then I've got the article where he decided to go fight on the other coast when it was about to be matched with Langford. Couldn't take the heat. But so anyway, I've been doing that and I've been totally distracted and I thought this was tomorrow and I'm an idiot. So I haven't even read anything. But real quick, Macon, Georgia, man, shout out to the great Otis Redding. And I think James Brown first recorded in Macon. I think he started his recording career in Macon. But Otis Redding, one of the all-time greats. The man had a voice like a saxophone. I listen to Otis every single day. We got him on vinyl too.
Okay, awesome stuff right there. Yeah, Otis legit right there. Sitting by the dock of the bay, one of my faves.
And also one of the other all-time greats. To me, the real king of rock and roll, the great Little Richard. I'm pretty sure he's from Macon, Georgia. So if you got Otis Redding and Little Richard, that's like having Joe Frazier's left hook and Rocky Marciano's right hand. in one town. That's incredible. That's some all-time great shit. That's the stuff that sets my soul on fire. So anyway, I've been doing that, but C.C. Smith, so I know almost nothing about him right now, and I'm mostly here to just listen to your show, but I wanted to just jump on and say I love what you're doing, and I can't wait for this, and shout out to everyone in the chat. What's up, boss?
Good stuff right there. Good stuff, Random. Hey, appreciate it, of course. And check out Random. Definitely, he's got it locked as it relates to Sam Langford. More stuff to come. I know we have a couple of discussions we need to finish up over there as well. We have a good discussion on 1903, which was meant to be the introductory discussion, 1903 in the lightweight division, that is, and we plan on to expand on that more and even take it further with some other weights as well as years. So I definitely look forward to that, Random, no doubt about it. And I appreciate you, dropping on for these quick few seconds or whatever for this C.C. Smith discussion. I'll dive into them for sure. But as always, it's always good to have you on. Be sure to drop your link in the chat as well.
Yeah, I'll try to do that before I have to bounce. But yeah, and that's cool to see you got the book too, man. There's only so many books of authority on this era. And so I'm just trying to gradually collect them. But Colleen Aycock, man, you should reach out to her and bring her on the channel. This lady is a legend.
Yeah, she's legit.
That's world class talent in her field, and I hope to talk to her at some point. Because I think I have 2 or 3 books now. Because I think also I have another book on the great colored fighters, basically early era colored fighters, and she was the co-author of that as well. So or maybe the editor, and then one of the articles is from her. But it's just magnificent. All this research, and I'm just very excited right now because I've been going back and organizing all my newspaper clippings. I realize I have a lot more than I thought I had.
Oh yeah. That's good stuff. Hey, I know you're on it. You have some rare pictures and all that stuff too. At least those 4 from newspaper clippings, which had some pictures that you probably don't just see out there randomly online as much. No pun intended. But yeah, I think that is pretty dope right there. And yeah, I look forward to more as you continue to dive in. Random, of course, as you all may know, or if you don't know, found an underreported Sam Langford fight through his research right there. So that is pretty awesome when you think about it after all these years. So expect more of that.
Yeah, that was fun. I just shot that off yesterday to Box Rec and Cyber Boxing Zone with the clippings from the Revere Journal and the Boston Globe that said that the bout happened. And it happened at a smoke talk. So smoke talks were like gatherings of people, right? And they do all kinds of different stuff. So this night, which was, let me think, Tuesday, February 24th. This is 3 days before he rematched Luther Manuel. And it's on State Road. It's the Berkeley Cycle Club in Beachmont, which is, I think, part of Revere, Massachusetts today, north of Boston. And yeah, they did. They had a catch wrestling bout. Then they had Greco-Roman wrestling. Then they had 3 boxing bouts. And Langford fought a guy named Young Jarvis. I found his profile in BoxRec, not many fights listed, but a lot of stuff's off the books. Certain towns at this time were banning smoke talks because they thought it was an end run around having prize fights. So they sang songs. There was a poetry reading. They had wrestling, 2 different kinds of wrestling bouts and boxing all on the same night. So this is a new avenue of my research now, looking at smoke talks and trying to dig up what I can. Because they were often under the books, or they were like, I think it was Lawrence, Massachusetts. There was an article. They said, no way we're going to allow these smoke talks as a guy's prize fighting. In other places, they were doing.
Yeah, that kind of ties to some of the things we mentioned and what I try to mention at least when thinking about some of these legends of the sports and all. So we have what's reported. Then there's a bunch of things that, of course, had to go or take place under the table. Boxing wasn't necessarily high on the radar as far as law enforcement, or it wasn't high on the radar. It was high on the radar in the minds of the people. It had fans and those that were interested in it. But from an official law enforcement legal standpoint, certainly it was not at the top of the list of sports that a lot of states, etc., wanted to deal with. So you had a lot of that sidebar stuff going on. Some of these fights that were official yet unofficial. So some of the reporting out there, it's been great that we've been able to get such, but there's probably a lot more that we haven't been able to capture because of such.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I'm doing now is I've got, I don't know, a few thousand clippings mostly from 1903, 1904. Now I'm just trying to piece it all together. Who was like, because clubs were springing up. So like Langford, he was eating a lot in that first full season. He was eating a lot off of the Essex Athletic Club. But the Essex only had one. They opened in 1902 with one thing, and then in 1903 he was on. I can't remember exactly how many, but I think it was like at least like 7 or 8 cards at the Essex Club. They would do weekly events, but it didn't last very long. In '04, things changed in Boston. The head of the police commission clamped down on it. So Langford's career, his opportunities changed. But for that first full season, I mean, it was wide open. His home base, the Lennox Club, and then the Essex Club, and then he fought in like Situate, Rhode Island. He fought Chelsea and Lawrence. I mean, he's fighting like all over New England at a schedule that just wasn't available the very next year in his home area. So it's a very interesting year. It was so fun talking about it with you. And so I'm piecing together the bookings that changed, because I don't know if people know, but like things will come together very quickly, a matter of weeks, sometimes even a matter of days. So a lot of times in the paper, they're talking, he's mentioned in the upcoming fights for that week more than one time, or as they're talking about him matched against somebody, he's also been matched. Since the last publication, he's been matched with someone else for the following week. So it's a crazy schedule, January 15th, January 22nd, January 23rd, February 6th. I mean, come on, he's just, he has 20 fights in the first 6 months of 1903. So it's great stuff. Again, I'm just Smith conversation. Try everyone in the chat. Let's move on. 1903. I got a lot more info.
All right, cool. Good stuff, Random. Yeah, you came out a little broken up with that last part, but we did get the bulk of the conversation there. But yeah, hey, salute to Sam Langford, one of the greatest fighters to ever lace him up. Yeah, all good. But yeah, one of the greatest fighters to ever lace him up, and another colored world heavyweight champion, or world colored heavyweight champion, however you want to slice it. But that being said, that was established by none other than C.C. Smith, subject of today's video. So Sam Langford is one of those multi-time, right, if I'm not mistaken, multi-time world colored heavyweight champion, which speaks volumes, because you had to run through some tough competition even when dealing with that title, and that speaks volumes in itself right there. You still there, Random?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sorry. My signal is... Yeah, I'm here, brother, but my signal is terrible, I'm afraid.
Okay. Cool.
Can you hear me?
All good.
Yeah, my signal's really bad. I'm on the move. I'm on my way to work, but I'm going to jump off the stream. Shout out to you, 86. Shout out to the Boxing Librarian and Scrapbook Boxing and everyone in the chat. And I'll be listening.
All right. Good stuff, Random. Have a good one, brother.
All right, brother. Peace.
All right, folks. Good stuff there. So salute to Random, jumped in, had a quick discussion there. I thought it was some good stuff for sure. We're going to dive a bit more into C.C. Smith, but Sam Langford, certainly one of the all-time greats there. Shout out to Scrapbook Boxing, doing his thing out there. Be sure to go check him out for sure, as Random mentioned. Joseph Phoenix says, was there an actual title belt? So there was an actual medal, actually, Joseph. There was a medal for the Colored World Heavyweight Championship, and that was by virtue of the National Police Gazette. They created a medal for the World Heavyweight Championship as well. They were the ones who established the belt that essentially became known as the World Heavyweight title. So there was a medal that was tied to it. There was a medal tied to it for sure. So C.C. Smith was the first recipient of such. So it started as a claim, as I mentioned, and then it went on to take a life of its own. Now, diving a bit more to C.C. Smith, he was about 5'11", 200 pounds. So he was a solidly built guy there. 5'11", 200 pounds, which for the time certainly would have been comparable to the likes of John L. Sullivan, who was right around that same height, right around that same weight. Both of them were matched up pretty well as far as the measurables were concerned. So C.C. Smith, 5'11", 200 pounds. And I bring up John L. Sullivan because that is very much relevant in its entire situation, given the fact that both John L. Sullivan and C.C. Smith kind of came to prominence around the same time. This was during the 1870s. And you think about that, we had one fighter, of course, a black fighter who was doing his thing, starting to get noticed and on the rise. And then we had John L. Sullivan, who was a white fighter who was doing his thing on the rise, started to get a lot of notice and buzz. And this is essential because this is around the time, and eventually it would, but the Marquess of Queensberry rules would eventually take over. And I think had the two of them fought, this would likely have been under the Marquess of Queensberry rules. And that would have played a significant role in the history of what we know as it relates to the overall title. Now, there's a video I did on the channel, and it's a John L. Sullivan related video, and it speaks to some of the fights that John L. Sullivan didn't have, in particular, 4 of the major fights. Now, they would have cemented his legacy in an even more major way. And the 4 fighters of note that it really focused on were C.C. Smith, George Godfrey, Old Chocolate George Godfrey, the original George Godfrey, Peter Jackson, Black Prince Peter Jackson, as we know, and Frank Paddy Slavin, who was a great Australian heavyweight who, much like Smith, is on the back end as far as those 4 names that I've mentioned. They don't get mentioned as much, but these are very much great fighters here. And I think that says a lot about them as well. And the thing is, John L. Sullivan, as I mentioned, he came to around the same time as C.C. Smith. These two were about the same size. And in John L. Sullivan, he ultimately won what was, I guess you can say, in some sense, essentially the American heavyweight title. Some would argue world heavyweight title, when in 1882, February 7th to be exact, he defeated Paddy Ryan. Now, this was under the bare-knuckle or London prize ring rules, and that ultimately ended up continuing on and translating to what would be the title that we see now. But Paddy Ryan at the time, who spent a good deal of his time more prominently in the bare-knuckle world, he ultimately ended up being the person that John L. Sullivan defeated that really gave him that stamp of prominence in his career. And so that was a major boost for him. And it was covered media-wise, Police Gazette, aware of it. They had some things to say about it. As a matter of fact, you can find some old Police Gazette pictures, at least, or the one from the actual cover of that particular event when he took on Paddy Ryan there. But this was 1882, as mentioned. Now, in 1883, C.C. Smith, subject of this video, he actually went to Boston. He went to Boston specifically to fight John L. Sullivan. Of course, he was a colored world heavyweight champion. He had established a claim, had an open challenge to anyone willing and ready to go. 1876, as I mentioned. And he went to Boston specifically to take on John L. Sullivan. And this would have been a major fight alongside the actual Paddy Ryan fight. This would have been the probably more significant fight of John L. Sullivan's career during that particular period in the early part of 1800s. Had this contest actually happened, and I say actually happened because, as history would tell us, it did not happen. Real quick, back to the comments real quick. Joseph Phoenix says, any medals left on display at, say, the Boxing Hall of Fame? I went to the Boxing Hall of Fame back in 2015, Joseph. They have a number of things in there. I'd imagine if they had anything from that time, they would. It may be in there, but I don't know if they would have any medal or anything from that period. Of course, John L. Sullivan, he also had a belt at one point that ended up being melted down because he had a lot of issues there later in career, and I think sold off that belt or whatever. So I don't know if they have any of those medals or belts. We have a picture, I believe it is, of a John L. Sullivan belt or the Police Gazette belt from some period down to that point. I don't know if it's actually there in the Hall of Fame or not, but that's a good question, though. Certainly one worthwhile. But yeah, they did have them at that particular time, though. They did have them. So something existed at some point. I don't know where they ended up. Alistar Overeem, salute, Alistar. I feel like it's been forever and a day, buddy. But appreciate you being here, of course. The Ream says John L. ducked him. Hey, kind of looks like that, right? Kind of looks like that in some sense. You know, some people may not want to believe it, but yeah, he definitely didn't. I mean, he could have made the fight happen. I think John L. could have made any fight he wanted happen. And yeah, he opted not to for sure. The boss says John L. didn't want to fight black boxers. Yeah, which is pretty crazy. It's crazy. He refereed, officiated fights with black fighters, all that stuff. But for some reason, didn't want to get in there with them. Maybe for the embarrassment of losing 2-1, I'm guessing. But that aside, I mean, it would have made for some very excellent matchups. Of course, we know what those matchups were. It would have been great if it happened. Salute to you, Max Duran says, how's it going? Salute there, Max. Appreciate you being here. As always, it's great to have you in the building there, Max. I know you dropped in Sunday as well, I believe. Yeah, so yeah, salute to you, Max. Great having you here, buddy. Random, salute to you there, Random. Appreciate you dropping by. Bob sends his regards. But yeah, so C.C. Smith, John L. Sullivan, a key thing, and I mentioned this in the latest video I did on John L. Sullivan and his rivalry with some of the boxers from that period. At one point in 1883, John L. Sullivan and C.C. Smith had practically identical records. And this would have made for an absolutely excellent fight, especially for those looking back on the history of it. John L. Sullivan was 16-0 with 16 knockouts. C.C. Smith was 16-0-1 with 14 knockouts. Just imagine that. If those two would have fought right then and there. This was 1883. It should have happened then. Sullivan, I repeat, 16-0 with 16 knockouts. So he had knocked out everyone. And C.C. Smith, 16-0 or 16-0-1 with 14 knockouts. So he had knocked out all but 2 in his wins, and then he had a draw. So just think about that. 2 undefeated. Pretty much like I was saying, they came to prominence at around the same time. So there's really no reason that should not have happened right there. I mean, what more could you ask for? They were essentially came to prominence at the same time. That's one of the things about the whole, when you're looking back on history. And we have that today. We see it today. Sometimes today we have those situations where there are fighters who ultimately don't have the fights when we expect or want to see them. But that being said, we kind of just deal with it, and we kind of give them the benefit of the doubt to a certain degree or whatnot. But ultimately, it's one of those situations where, wow, we had those opportunities. And we sometimes get fights too late. The similar thing right here. This should have happened. Max Duran says John L. Sullivan and C.A.C. Smith, both in their primes, would be interesting. It would be very much interesting. Very much. Dan says twice scheduled fights, John L. Sullivan versus George Godfrey, and right up to the minutes before the fight, police came and broke them up. Oh, yes. That would almost happen. So George was the closest to getting to it, and I think that would have been an interesting one. And actually, I favor John L. Sullivan in that contest with George Godfrey, who was very much a legit fighter, real deal guy, very skilled, tip-top shape. He was a little smaller than Sullivan, and I think that would have ultimately been his downfall in their contest, because I think Sullivan would have had a little bit too much size for him, even though they were generally not too far off height-wise, but Sullivan was the bigger guy, no doubt about it. And I think actually he would have stopped George Godfrey, who was an excellent boxer from that period. But you know, you never know, though. You never know how things would have gone. Godfrey was probably the more polished from a fundamental standpoint. But that being said, Sullivan he was an offensive, or he would put on onslaughts offensively, and he was one of those individuals you had to watch at every second of every round because he really gunned for it on the offensive end. And make no mistake about it, he didn't come into the ring to be friends. He came in gunning for a knockout. And George Godfrey was as game and tough as they come, but I think eventually Sullivan would have worn him down with the offensive onslaught that he would put on with a number of these fighters. As a matter of fact, while I'm here, and since we're thinking about it, before we dive a bit further, I felt why not just show you kind of some of the things that are tied to that rivalry overall, because as mentioned, there is a video on the channel that's tied to John L. Sullivan, and that's what I'm gonna bring up right here. And I want you to watch and hear this right now because I think it gives you a picture of that C.C. Smith rivalry, and then we'll dive in further as we think about what could have ultimately been.
Subscribe. Charles A.C. Smith, also known as C.C. Smith or C.A.C. Smith, was the first claimant of the colored world heavyweight title and thus recognized as the first to hold such distinction as early as 1876. Managed by Wild Bill Muldoon, a famous wrestler who would ironically go on to train Sullivan for his 1889 world heavyweight title contest with Jake Kilrain. At around 5'11", 200 pounds, C.C. Smith matched well against Sullivan regarding the measurables. Furthermore, Sullivan and Smith came to prominence around the same time. Smith was considered a clever, powerful, and explosive fighter, earning him the nickname the Black Thunderbolt. Smith was estimated to have participated in over 200 fights during his career, both gloved and bare-knuckled. On February 7, 1882, John L. Sullivan defeated Paddy Ryan under London prize ring rules, essentially bare knuckles, to solidify his claim as the heavyweight champion of America and, depending on who you ask, the world. Fast forward to 1883, and C.C. Smith issued an open challenge to box John L. Sullivan in a 4-round glove match or a bare-knuckle contest. Additionally, C.C. Smith had the backing of Richard Kyle Fox, owner of the National Police Gazette and arguably the most powerful man in boxing at the time. After covering the 1880 heavyweight contest between Paddy Ryan and Joe Goss, the Police Gazette became the unrivaled standard for boxing news and coverage. With Police Gazette's backing, it meant that you were considered the best fighter in the world in your weight class. It should also be mentioned that Fox and Sullivan were arch enemies who routinely took shots at each other through the better half of the late 1800s. Now, it could be argued that Fox had a vendetta against Sullivan and would have backed anyone against him, but Smith and Sullivan had practically an identical record at the start of 1883. Sullivan was 16-0 with 16 knockout victories, while C.C. Smith was 16-0-1 with 14 knockout victories. C.C. Smith traveled to Boston in early 1883 with the specific quest of facing John L. Sullivan. The fight never materialized, as it was also reported that Sullivan would not fight him because he was a man of color. Despite never facing Sullivan, C.C. Smith did share the ring with many other notable fighters of his era, including Professor Charles Hadley, who was the third man to ever win the colored world heavyweight title, defeating Morris Grant, who had took that title from C.C. Smith. C.C. Smith also laced up gloves against Old Chocolate George Godfrey, a former colored world heavyweight champion and someone we'll hear from again. He also faced the Harlem Coffee Cooler Frank Crow, colored world middleweight champion, Joe Butler, a former colored world middleweight champion. He faced the California Terror Joe Chewinski, a man who famously knocked out Jack Johnson, the Irish giant Peter Marr, a claimant of the world heavyweight title, George Gardner, the second ever man to hold the world light heavyweight title, and the tough and rugged bare-knuckler turned boxer Jim Smith, former champion of England. C.C. Smith was a legitimate threat to John L. Sullivan. Old Chocolate George Godfrey is a name that should be.
All right, so we saw that. Yeah, I was able to take a visit to the restroom while that happened. I saw that was on camera. Doesn't always work out the way you expect, but anyway, good stuff. So that was a little bit on C.C. Smith right there that you got. Dan says, I too would favor John L. Sullivan, but Godfrey was one of the greatest, very underrated. No doubt about it there. No doubt about it, Dan. Yeah, I think the size is one of the things that would come into play overall in that contest. Tobias says only slick guys like Corbett could beat Sullivan back then, it seems. Well, yeah. Yeah, but it would have been interesting though to see how he would have done with a puncher like Frank Patty Slavin, who was very much like a Jack Dempsey during that period. And he was the guy who was bigger than Sullivan at 6'3", about 200 pounds, and he had a punch on him, Australian heavyweight there. So it would have been interesting to see. But in dealing with some of the other, I guess you can say, punchers from the time, to throw in as someone like Jake Kilrain, who wasn't necessarily, I guess, a huge puncher. But that being said, yeah, Sullivan usually dealt with those guys. And a lot of guys he dealt with were very much offensive type fighters who were accustomed to fighting and throwing a lot of punches on the offensive side, or many of his opponents who he ended up dealing with ultimately just didn't have that overall skill set, but just were there to try and knock him out or get some form of a punch off on him, because he went on a worldwide tour, first in the country, then he took it globally in some sense. But he struggled with some guys who could move on him. The one in prominence, Charlie Mitchell, who we'll have to do a live on Charlie Mitchell. He's really kind of a middleweight, but he ended up fighting up in weight and became a heavyweight, or at least more so accustomed to heavyweight. And he troubled Sullivan because he was smaller. He could move a bit. And now when they first fought, of course, some of the issue or situation was it was under London prize ring rules, and Mitchell did what he could do to stay away for the most part, and it ultimately ended up being a draw. That's the first. That's one of the first draws, or that is the first draw on Sullivan's record there. So that's just an example right there. So he wasn't necessarily fond of dealing with those type of fighters who would move, be more on the defensive side, not engage, but, he could account for himself and deal with it, depending on the situation. But yeah, Sullivan versus C.C. Smith, that would have been a hell of a fight to have had happen. We didn't get that. But that being said, it doesn't stop or take away from the fact that C.C. Smith, he was able to put in a lot of work, as I mentioned, and diving into that, that's when you really see things come out as far as C.C. Smith's overall record, who he was in with. And I guess you can say that kind of ties to his ability in some sense. So that factors in pretty well. So with that in mind, so here is a listing of who C.C. Smith was in with, at least from a prominent standpoint. These are some of the guys that C.C. Smith faced off against. Charles Hadley, Professor Charles Hadley, that is, who's a former colored heavyweight champion. As a matter of fact, he is the second world colored heavyweight champion, Charles Hadley. And you will have saw him in that last little video clip I showed from the Sullivan video. So Professor Charles Hadley, second colored world heavyweight champion. Those two faced off more than one time. That's a prominent fighter on his record. Now, Hadley isn't as known these days. But that being said, he was a solid guy in there with a lot of opponents. He was also, C.C. Smith, this is, in the ring with Frank Craig, the Harlem Coffee Cooler, former colored world middleweight champion, a guy who obviously fought at heavyweight as well, a guy with a ton of fights. He also spent a good deal of time in the UK. I believe it was England where he spent a good deal of time at. Matter of fact, almost like a second home to him in some regards, and he built up a large fan base there. He was prominent there over on that side of the pond. So Frank Craig, that's another fighter that C.C. Smith was in with. of course, George Godfrey, who we just spoke of briefly, the original George Godfrey, Old Chocolate George Godfrey, former colored world heavyweight champion, one of the greats to do it, Hall of Famer as well, someone who was in with a tough bit of competition himself. So C.C. Smith was in with George Godfrey as well. So that's someone who, from a commonality or from a sort of common fight standpoint, he's someone who did fight Peter Jackson, who came up earlier, who would have potentially been an opponent there of C.C. Smith. That would have been an interesting one, as I mentioned. So C.C. Smith also fought Joe Butler, former colored world middleweight champion, another guy who fought at heavyweight. As a matter of fact, C.C. Smith was the first to defeat Joe Butler. Think about that. Former colored world middleweight champion there, Joe Butler. He had a good number of fights. I think probably around that 100 range, somewhere in there. And he had varying results, but, it was certainly different during those period of time. So you could have a number of draws, some losses. The circumstances could have dictated such, but he was a fairly prominent fighter during that period. Former colored world middleweight champion Joe Butler, and C.C. Smith was the first to defeat him. Peter Marr, the Irish Giant, that's another one he was in with, former world heavyweight title claimant. We all know of him, the Irish Giant, Peter Marr. So that's someone else C.C. Smith shared the ring with. George Gardner, the second ever light heavyweight champion of the world. That's someone else that C.C. Smith ended up sharing the ring with. George Gardner of Irish descent, just like Peter Marr. But yeah, one of the greats that we'd seen. And as Random Acoustic Thoughts mentioned there, one of three well-known boxing brothers out of Lowell, Mass. That's good stuff right there. But yeah, the Gardner brothers, you'll see Jimmy Gardner. You'll see him. He's popped up in some videos we've done on the channel. And that is legit stuff. And Al also, Random says Smith fought some dudes. Most certainly, he fought some dudes. He definitely did there, Random Acoustic Thoughts. Also, Joe Chowinski, great light heavyweight fighter. Joe Chowinski famously knocked out Jack Johnson, but in addition to such, was in with some of the best ever. You name it. Tom Sharkey. I mentioned Jack Johnson, of course. He was in there with Jim Corbett. He was in there with Barbados Joe Walcott. That's a name right there to know. So Joe Chowinski, very underrated, would have been world light heavyweight champion, I believe. I've said that on a number of occasions. So that's someone you should know of. Jim Smith. We have a video out there on Jim Smith and Joe Chowinski, for that matter, as well as George Godfrey. Some of these guys we mentioned. We have a little short video out there, not short as in the sense of YouTube short, but a short video as in it's not lengthy, but it dives into some of the boxing matchups of Jim Smith, who was probably at his best in the bare-knuckle ranks, where he was British heavyweight champion at one point, or at least European heavyweight champion, one of the two. I think I mentioned it in that video, but he was a prominent fighter during that period. And this is a guy, look at the video, look at the pictures that are tied to him. You'll see he was built like a tank. Jim Smith was built like a tank in the literal sense back in those late 1800s. He was built like a tank. And if you don't know what that means, look up Jim Smith. Put in Google Jim Smith boxer, and you'll see built like a tank. And that's all I had to say about that. Then, of course, he was in there with Black Diamond. This was a fighter who I don't know a ton about Black Diamond, but he was in with a good deal of competition. Someone I need to dive into a bit more. But he fought at heavyweight. He was one of those scrappy guys who would dive in, dig in, really compete with anyone. It didn't matter. He competed in lower weights as well as in heavyweight. Then I mentioned John Donaldson, not a huge name right there, Professor John Donaldson, that is, but he is someone who also shared the ring with the likes of one John L. Sullivan. So he was of some type of prominence to a certain degree there, Professor John Donaldson, that is. So he's someone certainly worth mentioning. He was in with a good bit of competition. So those were some of the prominent names that C.C. Smith ultimately was in with, certainly of note, that is. And I think that speaks volumes to who he was as a fighter. Max Duran says some of the best fighters may be fighters that have an average record but fought everybody and were not afraid to fight anybody. That's most certainly the case right there, Max. I think you're spot on there, buddy. That was the case. If you look through history, you'll see fighters who don't have that shiny whatever in old record. And that doesn't necessarily mean they were bad fighters. As a matter of fact, in most cases, they were some of the toughest, the best, the technical, the toughest fighters that we've seen. And oftentimes, when you think about a fighter of the past and you look at that record and you see that they have losses, sometimes multiple losses in the double digits, then it was often because they were in with a number of fighters who were the type to be able to hand individuals of that caliber losses. So there would be exchange of wins, the exchange of losses. Is just a matter of competition. The competition then was at a high level. It's hard to put it into perspective if you don't dive into the history yourself or you haven't really looked into it. So it's hard to put it into perspective, but the competition back then, it was higher. It was a greater amount of competition, I would say, than it is now. Of course, you had great fighters in every era. Even here today, we have great fighters or fighters that we know of who are active now who would go on to be considered great fighters. But if you think about it back then, there were more fighters who were competing. They all wanted that bread. They all wanted to be breadwinners. They wanted that opportunity. So these were very tough eras. And as I've always mentioned, the conditions in general just were very much tougher and different than today. I've said it once and I said it 1,000 times that we have luxuries today that those fighters back then, they couldn't even think of. They wouldn't even have fathomed some of the luxuries we have here today in the sport of boxing, let alone life in itself. So therefore, it's just tough to be a boxer in those eras, and they really brought the sport to. And contrary to some misconceptions, some think that these fighters back then weren't skilled. And I'm not going to dive into it to a deep degree, but you're mistaken if you think that was the case, because these fighters were very much skilled. And the sweet science in itself, it didn't start with James J. Corbett. It did not. It started well before him. Some of the guys who trained him, the guys like Professor Mike Donovan. We have a video on him. It's a small video. Need to dive a bit deeper into him. But it started well before him, going back to the bare-knuckle days. So the science of boxing, it's been there. Believe it or not, it's been there. And these guys were very much skilled. And if you think about it overall, more skilled than a lot of these fighters that we have fighting here in modern common times, to be honest with you. I know it may be hard to put it together, fathom, because you hear people on or hear some of these sports programs or whatever saying that, oh, everyone today is bigger, stronger, better or whatever. But hey, it's not a apples for apples type situation or comparison. Very much apples to oranges as far as this era versus the eras back then. You know, it's crazy. Dan says C.C. Smith, great fighter, great champion, but later he moved up in quality. Seems he wasn't the same. So yeah, he did run into some stiff competition and took some losses there for sure because of such. Toughest era ever. Salute to you there. Dan also says toughest era ever. No doubt about it. That was one heck of an era. One heck of an era there. It's, you know, to put it in perspective, it's just I mean, yeah, it's so tough because we can only go to, in most cases, common comparisons to right now. But you just think about it; these guys are. It was not out of the realm of possibility that a guy would have his first fight against a Hall of Famer. It just that's the way the era was. Here we don't fathom seeing that today. We praise Lomachenko, who's done well, who started out pretty tough. He had a great amateur career and started out pretty tough. Fought for a world championship in his third fight. That's pretty crazy right there. But that's pretty much some tough stuff to deal with there. I think it was his third or fourth fight. Fought a former world champion in his third or second fight. I can't remember when he fought Salido, but that might have been the third fight. And that's a tough ass, but it was a common thing back then. Very much a common thing. So there are very, very much differences, and you got to really dive into and look into these guys, because I think that's when you really put it into perspective. Dan mentions 1800 to 1900, greatest era ever heavyweight. An argument can certainly be made. And I've said this, Dan knows this. I know for certain 100% fact that Dan knows this. Australia, they produced some of the best heavyweights in the world during that period. It wasn't necessarily America. It wasn't just all America and some of the other countries out there, but Australia, you can make an argument they produced the best heavyweights of that era in terms of the overall numbers. They just had some real dogs who were heavyweights during that period. So yeah, an argument can certainly be made that was the greatest era of heavyweights forever. You just think about some of the guys that actually fought during those eras. You're talking about Paddy Ryan, Jim Mace, John L. Sullivan, who we mentioned, C.C. Smith, who's the subject of this video, Peter Jackson, the Black Prince, George Godfrey, Jim Smith, who I mentioned, Jake Kilrain, Charlie Mitchell, another one that I mentioned, right, that was tied to that particular era. But you think about it else, Bob Fitzsimmons, he's tied to that era. James J. Corbett, he's tied to the era as well. Joe Goddard, Australian heavyweight. Mick Dooley, having the Australian heavyweight championship, that was a big deal during that particular time. Those are just some of the greats who laced them up and been a part of this history. And that's only to name a few. You got guys like Denver Ed Martin, who started in the late 1800s. You have Jack Johnson. He started during that particular period. I mean, just think about that. I mean, I could go on. James J. Jeffries, freaking, so many. Gus Rulin. I mean, I could go on forever. We have videos out there on the channel. You can dive into it a bit more, of course. But that was a hell of an era just for heavyweight in general in the sport of boxing, let alone some of the other weights. But certainly when you think about heavyweight, there was no question as to what the marquee division was in the sport of boxing, and it was undoubtedly heavyweight. These days, there's a question as to what the marquee division is. Now, I often say it's heavyweight because I'm tying on the traditional aspect of it. And we have some prominent heavyweights out there, but it wouldn't even have been a question during this era that we're discussing here, because why would you even question such? Heavyweights, baby, the big guys going at it. That's what mattered the most as related to the fights that were taking place in the sport of boxing. That may have changed over the last decade plus now, but most certainly, when you think about boxing at its best, the heavyweight division is most certainly the reason behind it. And I can name names that will solidify such, but I don't need to do that because you know who they are. Time for the Kickback says 1800 to 1890 was a horrible era, in my opinion, just because black fighters were avoided at the time and they deserved a shot. You can make an argument there for sure. Time for the Kickback. But that being said, those black fighters were top tier fighters, elite fighters, and some of them, so they weren't able to fight for the world heavyweight title, which is a travesty. But that being said, there were those fighters who crossed color lines and they fought, and there were heavyweights that were mixed in there who actually fought. So that's really the downplaying part of it for sure, that they didn't get to fight for the world heavyweight title, which would have made for some very excellent fights that would have likely been filmed as we get to the 1890s and such. But certainly, yeah, you make a good point, Jess, with that as mentioned. But it was a great era, because even with the black heavyweights that were out there who didn't get to fight for the world heavyweight title, there were no doubt top shelf. So that is something to mention there. But I feel where you're coming from. I definitely get where you're coming from there. Time for the kickback. Dan, why is cruiserweight the dominant heavyweight today? A cruiserweight division is but you're right. Yeah, Alexander Usyk, pretty crazy. But yeah, he's moved up and did his thing. Very skilled fighter there, representing Ukraine, doing his thing. So yeah, cruiserweight division. I think that's been a very good division here in the last several years. As a matter of fact, dating back to even the last decade plus, cruiserweight has had a brevity of talent, and they haven't quite got the recognition that they probably deserve. A lot like some of the historic heavyweights of the past, but they've produced some very great fighters, no doubt. Intro to the artist. Salute to you. Intro to the artist. Appreciate you dropping in. But he says, time for me to go to school. Good stuff right there. Intro to the artist. Hey, we're talking Charles C.C. Smith. Great fighter from that period. First colored world heavyweight champion. Oh, while you're here, give us a like. If you haven't, give us a like. If you haven't subscribed, make sure to subscribe. I want to keep in contact with you all. If you're out there lurking, I want to keep in contact. So, hey, come on. Stay with us. We're cool. We're going to do some big things moving forward. Max Duran says, yeah, Pete Rademacher fought Floyd Patterson for the title in his pro debut. Yeah, that is correct there. That is correct there, Max Duran. He didn't win it, but he fought the fight. He fought the fight. Rare. That's a very much a rarity right there, to see someone go straight to the world title in their first fight. And also, most aren't bold enough to do such. Regardless of what you think of the fighter. Some of them know the deal. They'll say one thing, but hey, they know what it is. Experience. That's something you really can't make up for right there. Experience. Especially in those pro ranks. So you're right there, Max. Good stuff. Time for the kickback says, I think cruiserweights are technically better than the heavyweights, but not physically, which is why cruiserweight will never be the heavyweight. Well, yeah, I guess if you look at it from the standpoint of if a cruiserweight at 200 pounds fought one of these heavyweights of the day, potentially that may be the case. But a cruiserweight moving up, Usyk showed that it can be done. Now, in the past, we were accustomed to seeing smaller fighters to a certain degree moving up in divisions and getting wins. But as mentioned, very skilled crop and or group of fighters during those periods. So I think that's why we were accustomed to seeing such. And not necessarily the case here these days, though it doesn't mean necessarily that it couldn't happen. But with the money and all, probably not going to happen as much. We're seeing Canelo versus Charlo. That's going to happen. A guy moving up 2 weight divisions. We don't see it often. And when you think about it, especially here in modern times, we don't often see the guy moving up, getting the win, something we mentioned in the Boxing Shit episode earlier this week. But we'll see what happens. I favor Canelo in that contest. But good point there. Time for the kickback. Early boxers had so many wins because they fought a lot of bums. Hey, you could say that right there. Not unlike some of these boxers of today. So go look through some of these resumes right here. Time for the kickback. You're going to see some names that you know, and you're going to see a multitude of names you've never heard of. Trust me, go look through. Go look through Errol Spence's resume. People always talked about Terrence Crawford. He hadn't fought anyone. Go look at Errol Spence's resume early on, who he fought. A lot of them you will not know who they are. So you make a good point to a certain degree there. Time for the kickback. But these guys fought way more often and The competition was mixed in. You would fight veterans of the sport who had a lot of fight experience under their belt early on. And you get that sometimes these days, not as much per se. But that being said, you say bums right there, time for the kickback. But go look at some of these resumes of these top fighters that are out there right now. Go look at Tyson Fury's resume there, time for the kickback. Go look at Deontay Wilder's resume. You could argue Anthony Joshua has the best resume of the heavyweights out there right now. And everyone has a certain way that they feel about Anthony Joshua, but look at his resume compared to, say, Tyson Fury's resume or Deontay Wilder's resume, where the best win on each of those two fighters' resume may be each other outside of Vitaly Klitschko or Vladimir Klitschko for Deontay or for Tyson Fury, who wasn't necessarily a spring chicken at the time. And of course, he wasn't a spring chicken at the time he fought Anthony Joshua as well. But go look at some of those resumes there. And I think you'll find out a lot of things there as it relates to the bum notion there, time for the kickback. Yeah, let's go check them out. That's all I would say right there. Most of their fighters were tune-up fights and only fought tough opponents every 8 to 10 fights. Well, that certainly matters if you have 8 to 10 fights in the course of 3 to 4 months, right? These days, 8 to 10 fights for most fighters, outside of when they're early in their career and they start to fight a lot, you don't see that. 8 to 10 fights, that's a span of like 5-6 years. For some fighters, even more than that, So it's not apples to apples, as I said there, time for the kickback. It's apples to oranges. You got to dive a little bit deeper into that. Dan says Corbin versus Peter Jackson, Slavin versus Peter Jackson, Armstrong twice versus Jeffries. A lot of great black fighters involved in the greatest fights in this era. Hey, no doubt about it there, Dan. Dan's kicking knowledge right there. Dan is kicking some straight up knowledge right there. So time for the kickbacks. Trust me, they were happening. There were some great fights happening. As mentioned, now the title shots, that didn't happen. But hey, these fighters, these black fighters in that era, they were legit. As a matter of fact, there were many who considered Peter Jackson to be the greatest fighter ever. And no, I didn't mince words there. They considered him to be the greatest fighter ever. This is a black fighter. They considered him to be the greatest fighter ever. And this was during the time of John L. Sullivan. This was in the time of other great fighters, black fighters, all. And there were those in media. And hey, I've got receipts in terms of accounts, articles from the time. There were those that considered Peter Jackson to be the greatest fighter ever. So despite him not getting a world heavyweight title shot, make no question, these dudes were legit during that period. They were certainly legit. Dan knows. Hey, today's fighter, sissy, hey, Dan going at it. But no, I feel you. Just gonna. Hey, I feel time for the kickback. Certainly. Hey, we can keep it clean, fellas. We can keep it clean, right? We can keep it clean. Dan said, no. Usyk is too small. Little small fighter is better. Speed and power, lean and mean. You know what I mean? Hey, that's right. Usyk was able to do his thing. Matter of fact, I thought that size was going to be a problem for Usyk in that fight with Anthony Joshua. Was I mistaken? Especially knowing what fighters of smaller stature have done in the history of the sport, especially dating back to the era we commonly talk about here on the channel. I still thought that size would be the main factor and the winning point of emphasis for Anthony Joshua. But was I wrong? That goes to show you skills pay the bills, baby. Skills most certainly pay the bills. Max Duran, yeah, Floyd Patterson ducked a lot of contenders. Customato wanted him to get a couple of cakewalks for his title defenses. Certainly, that was the case there. Max. That most certainly was the case there. Yeah, I know he didn't want him to have that listing fight. That would have been, it turned out to be kind of sort of bad juju for him. But even leading up to it prior to that. He didn't want him to have it. He knew he wasn't ready. Salute to Alexander Campbell. Alex, feel like it's been a long time, buddy. Appreciate you being here. Alex says Steely fought Dixon for the bantamweight title in his first fight in 1892. Okay, cool. Oh, Skelly. Okay, Skelly. Yeah. Jack Skelly. That name, right? Jack Skelly. Skelly had been a highly regarded amateur. He had backers and people betting on him to win. Good stuff there, Alex. Matter of fact, I guess since we're on here, I mentioned in the last stream, I'm actually working on a video on George Dixon. It's going to be a long one. I wanted it to be the next video that I release, but it's going to take a while. I've already started it. I haven't worked on it in about 2 weeks or so because I was out traveling, but it's going to be a big one. It's going to be a big one. There's nothing huge or prominent out there on George Dixon, and who knows, maybe one of these guys comes out here and drops something. Now that I said that, they said, okay, yeah, I'm going to beat you to the punch. But that being said, working on the George Dixon video, and I think it's going to be a good one. So I look forward to it for sure. But yeah, good point there, Alex. Jack Skelly. Max Duran, I'm pretty sure Holyfield was the cruiserweight starting out, if I'm not mistaken. Indeed. You're right there, Max Duran. He was. And we saw what he was able to go on to do. So, yeah, size matters in some situations, but not all situations. So size has its limit. Look at how big Primo Carnera was and what Joe Louis was able to do against him. He knocked him out. So size matters to a certain degree. Intro to the artist, all eras elite fought bums, if we're honest, in all weight classes are guilty. Yeah. Intro to the artist, 100% sure. 100% sure. People associated more with some of the old school eras, probably oftentimes because they don't know the names necessarily. But yeah, that's what I'm saying. I was pointing out some guys. I mean, we can dig through all of them. Even your favorite fighter now, Gervonta Davis, look at his resume, some of the people he fought early on. It's a systematic means of going about building a fighter. There's a systematic approach and means of going about building a fighter. So just look at it. Just look at them all. I mean, you name it. Even as I mentioned, some of your favorite fighters. You can go to every division. Dimitri Bivol early on, he had some guys you probably won't know. Great fighter right there, Dimitri Bivol. Doesn't get the recognition he deserves in some cases. Great fighter. I've seen him on a number of occasions, live and in person. Real deal. But yeah, you dig through his resume, you'll see some people you don't like. Artur Beterbiev, before he came to prominent, yeah, of course you're going to see some guys. I don't know who that is, where he's from. You just name it. We can go down every division. Canelo, I mean, he started out at a young age. He had to build his resume somehow. David Benavidez, we're still waiting for him to fight Canelo, which will be an excellent fight. But if you look at the early part of his career, you won't know the names. Most often, you won't know any of those names that are tied to it. Floyd Mayweather, same case. I mean, you just name it. It's just one of those things. I could go on, so forth. I could go on. Manny Pacquiao, he had some fights against some opponents that, of course, he was supposed to beat those guys, Tough resume overall, but come on now. We can name this. We can do this with any fighter at any point. Dan and 4 Kicks settle it with the gloves. Good stuff there, Max. Dan says, anytime with gloves, I think I'm the only KO artist out here. Let's go. Let me promote that, Dan. Let's do it. If you're down for it, Dan, let's do it. Let's host it in Washington, D.C. We can do it. Let's do it. Dan says, been a fighter since 5 years old. Still got it. Hey, Dan's not afraid to step in there. We can do it on the amateur side, Masters division. Let's do it, Dan. Intro to the artist says, hey, Chris Bird is kind of recent example of the smaller man going up in heavyweight having success. True. That is very much true right there. Intro to the artist. Very skilled fighter right there. And that's what took him to that level. Skills took him to that level. So Chris Bird, very good example, recent example. You could argue Michael Moore, he was able to win a heavyweight title, starting at light heavyweight. Roy Jones, of course, we saw him start at middleweight, win a light heavyweight or win a world heavyweight title. Yeah, I mean, you can go on. You can name even more of them that have gone on. Usyk, of course, we know right now. There have been some others who have come up and won titles at higher divisions or even moving up to heavyweight. I mean, I think it's just the name of the game. You have skills, especially when we dig into back in the day. So many I don't even have to name. And there are videos out there of such, and you see it happening. But I don't necessarily need to name them. But you know what the deal is. Then Ali was an Olympic light heavyweight. Floyd Patterson was a middleweight Olympic. Joe Louis, Marciano, Dempsey, Tunney, all the greatest are about 189, 6 foot. Right. Good stuff there, Dan. Good stuff. I think you make an excellent point right there. And that can't go unnoticed right there. That can't go unnoticed. I think that's the truth of the matter as it relates to these fighters from that period. And then that size didn't necessarily mean you were going to be the greatest. Dan, only great heavyweight champions that were big: Jeffries, Foreman, Max Baer. Those are some good ones right there who were big. And heck, if you really look at it, those guys compared to some of the heavyweights we see today aren't as big. Look at Tyson Fury, 6'9", 270 plus. These guys weren't even as big as that. So you think about that. That's pretty crazy to think about what they were able to do. And they were considered big for their time. And they would compete and be big to a certain degree in these eras. Think about guys like Foreman, of course. Baer, 6'2", Foreman, 6'3", 6'3"-ish, and 200 plus. Baer, same thing. He's 6'2", 300 plus or 200 plus. Then Jim Jeffries, about 6 foot, 6'1", 200 plus. So, these were some solid guys right there. But they were able to do their thing. But they were in the best condition and primed and ready for their times. And there were guys who were the size of Anthony Joshua and some of these big heavyweights we know today. And guess what? They took L's. Jess Willard was a big guy. Wasn't super skilled. He won the world heavyweight title and all, but we saw what Jack Dempsey did to him. Matt Duran says, get your press conference face. Certainly. Fitzsimmons, 160 pounds. Most certainly. 160 pounds. You see what he was able to do? Rose up in weight, up to heavyweight. So he started out small by certain standards. Sam Langford, another one who started out around lightweight, rose up to heavyweight, was able to knock guys out. And there's so many things you have to factor in. It's not apples to apples. I have that board game Apples to Apples somewhere here, and boxing is certainly not apples to apples. Max Duran says, speaking of weight classes, Roberto Duran and Manny Pacquiao were animals, no doubt about it. Fighting machines right there. Look what Manny Pacquiao was able to do. Look what Roberto Duran was able to do. Went up, even if it's probably not necessarily, it wasn't the best weight classes for them, but hey, it didn't matter. They were about that life. Smelling, Jimmy Ellis, two great fighters right there. Not huge heavyweights or whatever, skilled. Look at Max Smelling. Come on. People sleep on Max Smelling. I'm going to do a vid on him at some point. But people, we got to stop sleeping on the likes of a Max Smelling. Great fighter right there. Big heavyweights usually not so great. Certainly. That's a good point right there. People rag on Primo Carnera. They say, he was unskilled and all that stuff. But he was actually a little bit more skilled than you think. World heavyweight champion, big guy, huge guy. He was the size of these heavyweights we see today. He won the world heavyweight championship. And, when you really think about it, he wasn't as bad as you think. Deontay Wilder isn't necessarily known for his skills. I guarantee you, if you look at all the film that is available out there on Primo Carnera, compare it to Deontay Wilder, you will see that Primo Carnera is the more skilled fighter. I'm just saying, more skilled fighter. Ezra Charles, Jersey Joe. Dan, you're doing too much right there, Dan. Stop dropping all these big-time names. Dan, you can't do that. We don't have enough live stream available for all these names that you're throwing out there, Dan. The Cincinnati Cobra, Jersey Joe, named after the great Barbados Joe. Walcott, Arnold Raymond Cream. Come on, Dan. That's too much right there. These people aren't ready. If you don't know about the history of the sport, you're not ready for that type of stuff. Not to mention that Edric Charles started as a great middleweight. But you know him as a world heavyweight champion, right? So, need I say more? Max Schmeling deserves his own movie. Intro to the Artist. You're right. Hey, maybe I can make that happen. Let's see if I can make that happen. You know, I've been wanting to do a documentary. Thought about the Dixon one. Maybe Max Schmeling is a good one. I view it as a challenge right there. That's very much a challenge. That would be a good one to make right there because there's some misconceptions out there about Max Schmeling. I've wanted to do a video on him right now, but I have one on the channel. If you haven't seen it, speaking of the only world champion, only world champion, does anyone know the only world champion to win the title via the world heavyweight title via disqualification? I probably gave you the answer away. Of course I did. Max Schmeling against Jack Sharkey. Not to be confused with Tom Sharkey. No relation to Tom Sharkey. Only world heavyweight champion to win the title via disqualification. Now, of course, we know him about Lewis. We know him by the Joe Louis fights, especially that second one. Woo, brutal beating he took right there, but great fighter there. He's one certainly worthy of a documentary right there, or movie, real live action movie for sure. Intro to the Artist. There are probably some documentaries out there somewhat like that. I'm going to look into it. If not, I'll do it. Why not? Why not? Max. Dan says all 180 pounds. Right. Some of them starting even lower than that right there, Dan. But they were fighting guys bigger. Didn't matter. They did their things. Max Duran said Bob Foster is underrated as well. Look at the guys that he knocked out. Line them up, knock them down. He moved up to heavyweight as well. One of the great light heavyweights we've seen moved up to heavyweight. You know, Force, the Sheriff, Bob Foster. So good one to point out there, Max Duran. Dan agrees as well. Bob freaking Foster, another good one there, the Sheriff. So make no mistake about it, these heavyweights of the past, they were just as formidable as these heavyweights of today, many of whom are not very skilled. Not all of them, but some are not very skilled. So you have to really weigh things based on what information is available out there. You know, if you haven't really dove into the history of some of these heavyweights or some of these fighters in general of the past, then I would refrain from throwing sort of judgments out there that aren't necessarily informed, because these guys were as real deal can get. Only man to make Ali bleed right there, Max Duran. Good point. Good point there, Max. Dan, one of 5 most brutal punchers ever. Hey, yeah, he certainly ranks up there. Dan, he certainly ranks up there. No question about it. Real deal fighter right there. So now I know we were talking C.C. Smith real quick. C.C. Smith. Let me show you. Let me show you here. C.C. Smith, the Black Thunderbolt nickname he got there. C.C. Smith. That's what he looks like there. Not a ton of pictures of C.C. Smith out there, but this is C.C. Smith, folks. I was able to colorize those, enhance them, clean them up a little bit. But this is the Black Thunderbolt C.C. Smith. As you can see, hey, dude had some size to him. He was ripped. I told you, 5'11", 200 pounds. So he was not just some little Slim Jim out there, you know. And for, you know, those here in modern time, say an individual that is out here right now, you say that these fighters back then weren't skilled, or you think that they weren't able to fight here goes C.C. Smith, 5'11", 200 pounds. Now, I guarantee you, if you were to have ran up on him in 1878 or 1879, you might think differently as it relates to whether or not he could fight, especially if you can't fight yourself. And I'm not saying you had to be some type of true fighter or anything, but hey, we know that regular fights, street fights, and all that stuff happens. And some modern individuals may look at footage and think, oh yeah, that guy couldn't fight or whatever. But let's take it back to 1876, 1877, 78, 79. Think about you now, especially with you having all of this knowledge. I guarantee if you go back to then, you with all the knowledge that you have and all of the skills that you know of, and you fought him, what you thought about relation to whether or not he could fight might change your mind right there. If you were to if somehow we could take a time machine back, and individuals who felt some of these fighters from the past couldn't fight, with all the knowledge that we gained, say we're able to take all of the knowledge that we have now, you as an individual go back and you apply all that knowledge. Heck, you can even be trained by any trainer in history for whatever period you need up to that point. You go back in history, you jump in that time machine, you jump in there, you go back and fight one of these guys. I think you'll be in for a rude awakening. That's just my opinion. But hey, that's just me. Others might have different opinions, but I'm of the opinion that, yeah, individuals saying that these dudes couldn't fight here on the computer or whatever, or here in real time, you can take all the knowledge that you have right now, go back and fight some of these guys. If we could travel in a time machine, I think it'll be a different story. Yeah, hey, we have better conditions now. You will have all the knowledge that is available out there on the internet. You can use AI to even pull up all the weaknesses, etc. I mean, we'll have a running book on these fighters, because we know those guys in the 1800s, early 1900s, realistically, they couldn't fight, right? They were not skilled. Certainly not like these fighters of today. They weren't skilled like these fighters of the day. So, heck, Joe Blow or Joe Smo, we should be able to go back and, hey, if we could hop in the time machine, go back and take on these guys, then if we were, just there fighting, messing around, yeah, we should be able to just handle them easily, because they couldn't fight, They didn't know what these guys of today know. I've heard that a lot. Yeah, they didn't know anything about fighting, They didn't know how to move their heads in the 1800s, 1700s even. But we'll stick with the 1800s. That's more relevant. We have some videos out there. Those guys, 1800s, early 1900s, they didn't know how to move their heads. So we should be able to win. If you take yourself, just put yourself back there, you go fight one of those guys. All you have to do is punch. They're not going to move their heads. Heck, they might even fight like this. We don't know if they're going to actually throw anything back. These stance that we see in these pictures like that. Are they going to throw a punch back? As a matter of fact, can we take punches? I think we can take some punches. I can take a punch. So, yeah, I wish we could go back and fight those dudes. Time machine, because no way those guys could fight. I don't care if they fought 300, 400, 500 times. I fought 7 times. I'll be able to do what I need to do. I'll be able to do what I need to do. Dan says Fitzsimmons, Julian Jackson, unless Alexis Arguello, Bob Foster. Certainly. Punchers right there. Dude was built. You're right, Rodolfo. A little over 20 years run. Certainly there. Oh, yeah, Joshua Woods. Welcome, Joshua. My fellow Joshua there. Salute to you there, Joshua. Appreciate you being here, buddy. As always great chatting with you there, Joshua. We had some good chats here in the comments. Check out Joshua, everyone. Give him a like and subscribe. Hey, always great to have you here. Great Bill, lean and mean, Dan says. Certainly, Dan. Certainly. Joshua Wood says they can fight under other rule sets in different gloves, etc. Yeah, you're right. But hey, let some of these guys from right now tell it. Yeah, those guys didn't know how to fight. Yeah, they were out there fighting and racking up these wins and losses, but they didn't know how to, fight. It's all a mirage there, Joshua. None of that stuff mattered. Joshua Wood says Lewis can beat Smith in a 12-round fight, perhaps, but put it in a 25-plus round fight. I favor the old-timers. Yeah. Certainly stuff you have to factor in there, Joshua, certainly, because, those conditions were different. We've seen Lewis tire out. He's going to have the size on Smith, no doubt, size and weight on him. Overall, he's going to have that. So, and Lewis was fairly skilled as a big man. So, he's one of those that certainly would translate. So he would make it a hell of a fight. But make no mistake about it, C.C. Smith wouldn't be scared or back down from him because of his size. Not at all. But you're right there, Joshua Woods. I tend to lean towards that. Herbert Slade, he was considered color back when he fought John L. Sullivan. Oh, great point there. You know what? I actually put that on a shorts video that I made right there. And I've said it in, I was having a conversation actually with my partner. She participated in this with me. So I've said oftentimes that Sullivan didn't fight a person of color, but certainly Herbert Slade would be considered a person of color. So he didn't fight a black fighter, I guess we can say, but Herbert Slade is a person of color. So I'm going to try to correct that. As a matter of fact, I'm going to do a video on Herbert Slade. That's one that I wanted to drop here not too long from now, but I haven't started it yet. But that being said, Herbert Slade, Mari, New Zealander. Ooh. You know how that goes. Hey, love that culture right there. So Herbert Slade, certainly. And he was expected to be competitive with John O'Sullivan, but Sullivan handled him. Herbert Slade, the Mari New Zealander. New Zealand, of course, close to Australia. So therefore, of course, there were a lot of fighters out of New Zealand who were considered to be some top-level heavyweights as well and competed during that period. Matter of fact, Mick Dooley, he's Australian. Who was the Australian that I'm thinking of? He only suffered one loss. I know you know him, Dan. I can't think of his name right now, but he was beat by freaking who the heck beat him? But he was not Australian. He was a New Zealander. Dang, his name slips my mind. But once I recall it, I'll mention it, of course. But, hey, New Zealand had some fighters as well. Make no mistake about it. Joshua Wood said Sullivan did a little head movement in that mock sparring with Corbett in 1910. Yes, he did. He did. Do that arm out there. Did a little fading. He was like throwing that left hand. He was like, he was showing that, hey, he knew how to feint and all that stuff. And, and I read the Sullivan. Matter of fact, I've gone through it a number of times, just in general, different parts of it. But the Christopher Klein book on Sullivan, he did a great job. I think he highlighted some of this as well. It was not like Sullivan was there just twiddling his thumbs. Speaking of Sullivan, I mentioned this in relation to C.C. Smith. Of course, C.C. Smith was managed by none other than Wild Bill Muldoon. If you don't know Wild Bill Muldoon, of course, he trained Sullivan for his fight with Jake Kilrain, where he officially became world heavyweight champion. I was having a conversation with someone in the comments in regards to something tied to the championship here yesterday, as a matter of fact, and I was mentioning that you could argue Sullivan was world heavyweight champion per se because, they made the comment. It might have been Big Bear. Salute Big Bear. He might have mentioned that with the colored world heavyweight title that C.C. Smith claimed be considered like the first world heavyweight title. But, I was mentioning, it gets complicated, of course, especially when you factor in England, champions of England, other countries as well. So technically, I guess you can say, the prominent one, when we think about that heavyweight champion lineage removed from the early bare-knucklers was Sullivan Ryan when he took on Paddy Ryan. I guess you consider that the American heavyweight championship, even though this was with bare knuckles, and therefore necessarily can't say that C.C. Smith was the first. So many complications as it relates to such. C.C. Smith didn't get to fight for the world heavyweight title. But that being said, Sullivan, he also ended up going on fighting Charlie Mitchell, etc. Charlie Mitchell was considered some form of a champion in England at the time, which certainly mattered. And it's just one of those complicated things. I mentioned that I guess you could say the world heavyweight title from a recognition standpoint was official more so in 1889 when Sullivan defeated Jake Kilrain. One of the things I've mentioned in other streams, I believe, is you can technically say it wasn't the undisputed world heavyweight title, but certainly, even though it may be mentioned as such, but certainly that's what is recognized as the world heavyweight title. Had C.C. Smith gotten the opportunity to fight Sullivan, could have changed. Or if Peter Jackson, which would have been the more relevant fight at that particular time, would have happened, then that would have decided the undisputed world heavyweight champion, because Jake Kilrain, prior to fighting Sullivan, he had defeated Jim Smith for the bare-knuckle championship of the world, or what was considered the bare-knuckle championship of the world. So in a sense, when Sullivan fought Kilrain when he fought him in 1889, that was essentially the bare-knuckle champion, and what you can say is the American bare-knuckle, or the world bare-knuckle champion, at least recognized as far as Jake Kilrain, the American bare-knuckle champion and American heavyweight champion. This is with gloves at that particular time. So therefore, that's kind of how that is established. I'm about to re-release this video I did once. That's called, I can't remember what it's called now, but it's on the channel. But it was called How John L. Sullivan Changed Boxing. But I'm about to re-release the mastered version of it. I'm going to update some of the graphics and things that are tied to it, or some of the animations, etc. And I think it'll be a good one, because I think it'll be revealing, and it kind of talks to that Marcus of Queensberry bare knuckle connection or whatever, and how things changed at that point. But certainly a relevant one for sure. Relevant situation. I just want to mention that. Dan says today would be called Pacific Islander, but then was up with the color not used today. Yeah. You're right, Dan. Intro to the artist. I'm an MMA guy, but these old dudes would legit kill it in a boxing match. Most certainly there. Hey, salute to you, intro to the artist. And there were a number of boxers who participated in these MMA style fights. Matter of fact, I was having a comment back and forth for dialogue, and more so dialogue in the comments on Sam McVeigh, former colored world heavyweight champion, who actually fought in some MMA fights in Australia, or these hybrid MMA style fights against guys who did jiu-jitsu, etc., while he was in Australia. Man, Australia, it's crazy. It's crazy. Americans, we only know a fraction of how much Australia meant to the heavyweight division back during these periods that we typically cover. I mean, we only know a fraction right there. That was if you didn't fight, or if you weren't fighting in Australia at a certain point, then you weren't fighting the best heavyweights in the world. And that's straight up frank. Or if you weren't fighting any Australian heavyweights, then you weren't fighting all of the best heavyweights in the world. That's just one of those frank things right there. But good point there. Intro to the artist there. But yeah, they would do some work. Joshua Woods. Yeah, internet is faster now. Certainly. My channel is more video games than boxing though. Okay, Joshua. All good. Check out Joshua. Hey, I'm into video gaming. I have an Xbox Series X, 86 boxing on there. Of course, 86 boxing spelled out because for some reason you're not allowed to have numbers. At least you can't start your gamer tag with a number. Yeah, these are some of the rules. Rodolfo Rivera Jr. Did I say salute to you, Rodolfo? I know you were in here. Salute to you, Rodolfo. Hey, shout out to Rodolfo Rivera Jr. Check him out. Rodolfo, young legend in the game. Young legend in the game out there saucing on these cats. Appreciate you, Rodolfo. He said, what you be playing? Dan, Herbert Slade was awesome. Certainly there, Dan. So Sullivan did handle him. Sullivan did handle Herbert Slade. No doubt about it. Joshua, no real plans for the next game. Okay. Harry Lang. Hey, look at that. Look at Dan. Harry Lang, I think that's his name. So yeah, Dan, hey, I told you Dan is on it. Dan, salute to you, man. I'm gonna get this little thing where I can actually make those little noises or whatever and have some applauses or different sound effects. I can't do that right now. I'm gonna make that happen here, Dan, because you needed a round of applause right there for that one, Dan. I knew you would be on it. Harry Lang. Harry Lang, that is the man right there. Only lost once in his career. New Zealander, Joshua Woods. He could be considered World Sullivan in around 1881 or so. Okay. Yeah. Like I'm saying, yeah. You could say that, the titles, especially heavyweight titles, were established with a claim. And yeah, certainly claim could be made there. Certainly, he had racked up a lot of notice to that point, and I think the writing was on the wall. So some were already considering him the best heavyweight during that period, Joshua. So that is a good point. Certainly subjective in that sense. Dan Harry Lang called himself the Fighting Mari, but his father Spaniard and half black, his mother all white, but from Tasmania. Oh yeah, Tasmania! Wow, the Tasmanian devil. Tough combinations, huh? Old Harry Lang. Yeah, certainly. That is funny there. Tasmania. Yeah, I remember someone, they had a heavyweight championship out of Tasmania too. You know how certain countries, specific provinces, etc., they had championships. I know that there was a Tasmania heavyweight championship. Actually, I believe that's the one that Harry Lang had, actually, Dan, and whoever beat him, I can't remember if that's Patty Slavin or Peter Jackson. Whoever gave him that loss, they won that, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. Good stuff right there, Dan, making some good points. Oh, he wasn't Mari? Oh, so you're saying he wasn't Mari? Of the Mari culture, I guess you can say then. I guess when you factor in what you mentioned there, of the Mari culture, I guess you can say. But yeah, Herbert Slade. Oh, Irish Whaler for Slade. Okay, good stuff. Joshua Wood says Sullivan was a major part of why boxing is legal. Imagine if Ali and Frazier had to hide in the woods for one of their epic fights. Yeah, that'd be crazy right there. Yeah, you make a great point there, Joshua. That is the case right there. That's kind of what I highlighted in that video that I'm talking about. I'm going to re-release right there, was how he was essential to that change because, as I said, the division that mattered amongst all divisions was the heavyweight division. There were some other divisions. There were other champions, of course. But the division that mattered when factoring in all divisions in boxing during the period, no doubt, it was the heavyweight division. And John L. Sullivan was prominently behind why we see boxing the way we see it today. Of course, rules have changed over the course of history. You know, improvements have been made to the sport. So that's another thing we think about these guys of today. It's a safer sport than what it was back then. So that's something that you have to factor in. It's a safer sport than what it was back then. And we talk about all the time of some of these guys who have issues who, you know, we saw fight in the last 30 years, 30, 40 years, right? And we talk about, oh, yeah, that guy has, or that person has, oh, it looks like, yeah, boxing did some damage to them, or their speech is different or whatever. It's safer than what it was. Of course, it's safer now than it was 30 years ago, 40 years ago. I guess you can say somewhere in there. But just imagine 1888. You think this was the same sport? You didn't have to retreat to a neutral corner at that particular time. You think this is the same sport? You ever gone 75 rounds? You know anyone today who's gone 75 rounds? Someone let me know. Dan says, good point, Joshua Woods. Certainly. Joshua Woods, bare-knuckle was a mix between wrestling and fist fighting. You were allowed to toss your foes over the waist. Certainly. And those guys had on those spiked shoes or boots, cleats, whatever you want to call them, basically like cleats. I've mentioned that before. I've seen many accounts of fighters using their boots in those bare-knuckle fights and drawing blood. That happened to Nonpareil Jack Dempsey. Yes, folks, there's another Jack Dempsey out there, and his name is Jack Dempsey. Now, that sounds funny when I say it, but there was a Jack Dempsey before the Manasseh Mauler that you know of, the heavyweight, of course, champion, one of, if not the most popular boxer ever. His name was Nonpareil Jack Dempsey. Originally, Kelly. Last name Kelly. For some reason, I can't remember his first name. But you know what I'm talking about. First middleweight champ. No, not the first middleweight champion. I think second middleweight champion of the world. But one of the great middleweight champions the sport has ever seen. Yeah, it's 86 boxing, dumb Xbox rule. Yeah, that's crazy, Rodolfo. Maybe I need to go to PlayStation. Xbox, you hear that? You better slide me a little moolah, Johnny Manziel style. Maybe I'll stick with you. Dan says, Fernan, Jackson, Slavin, Goddard, Fitzsimmons, Harry Lang, Jim Hall, Mick Dooley. Hey, Dan, stop dropping all these names right here. People don't know that those are guys who were basically running ship in Australia. Dan, those are too many names to be dropping right there as it relates to Australia. Hoorah, salute to you. That's my man. I know that's my man based on what's right there. Greg Sandrich, salute to you. Motivated, ambitious, driven. Salute to you, bro. Appreciate you dropping in here, no doubt. Hey, be sure to come by more. We gotta talk. I gotta get you on. Hey, this dude right here puts in that work. I'm gonna get you on here. Greg, go make it happen. Dan, Slavin KO Lang. Okay, yeah, it was Frank Patty Slavin. Man, y'all need to look into Patty Slavin. That video I showed a little bit earlier in relation to this discussion on C.C. Smith, I kind of talked about Patty Slavin, or I did talk about Patty Slavin. He was one of those guys that would have been excellent to have seen fought John L. Sullivan, and it should have happened. Can't deny it should have happened. So with Sullivan, yeah, it's not just about, hey, him not fighting a black fighter. There were some other fighters that he should have fought as well. Frank Patty Slavin was one of them. One of the best heavyweights in the world at the time, and he should have fought for that world heavyweight title because there were lesser fighters who did fight for it. So in all the videos in that video I mentioned, the real point that I'm putting out there is the fact that there were lesser fighters who fought for the world heavyweight title. So those guys that I mentioned should have, and no question about it, Frank Patty Slavin should have fought for the world heavyweight title. It didn't happen, but it should have happened. But we're all too familiar with that, especially these days. Dan, While Lang was champion, he beat up someone and stole his money, 200 pounds, and did a year in prison. Wow, crazy. While champion, he somehow fell off a train and his legs were severed. He died the next day. Holy crap. Yeah, that's pretty tough. I remember you mentioned he died a pretty gruesome death. Some of those guys from Australia, the outback there, I mean, they have crazy critters, animals, and critters and amphibians, all that stuff in Australia, in that area, Australia, New Zealand, but more so Australia is what I'm thinking of. They have crazy amphibians and critters that could kill you in some maybe a split second, but can kill you. It's a wild place right there. So that's a wild way to go out there, Dan. Thanks for sharing, for sure. Joshua Wood says the heavyweights may not be the most skilled, but they are the only division that counts, and most boxing change came from the heavyweights. Most certainly, Joshua Wood. Salute to that. Major highlight should go out to that because you are speaking truth right there, Joshua Wood. They have invoked change. Max Duran says Frazier lands a left hook and Ali falls out of the ring and lands in the bushes. Good one right there. That would have been a sight right there, and certainly would have been a story to read. But hey, with some of these individuals today, because they didn't see it, hey, Frazier and Ali, they weren't any good. They were bums. All we have is a newspaper account of it. They were bums. You get the picture, right? Joshua Wood says, I saw the commercial with Ezra Charles just before he died, crippled and can't move and in a wheelchair. He should not have gone out. Yeah, that's an unfortunate side of things. That's certainly an unfortunate side of things. When the spotlight's gone, etc. Man, oftentimes there's nobody there except family. And in a lot of cases, not even all of the family, maybe a few people in the family. And heck, in some cases, even when it's family, that doesn't necessarily mean they have your best interests. You being the fighter who put in all of that work, who can't necessarily defend yourself and go about doing what you used to do. So certainly sad sight. We have boxers here today suffering from some of the effects of such. Think about Wilfredo Gomez having issues. Wilfred Benitez started at a young age, youngest world heavyweight or youngest world champion, I think what they recognize him as, at 17, I believe he was. Yeah, not doing too well now. Some others not doing too well. Nobody's there. Check out the video on the channel for Joe Grimm. Just look him up, Joe Grimm. He's one of those guys. He was basically used, you could argue abused during his career, probably more on the abused side than used side. And his ending wasn't too well. And of course, nobody was there to, really do much for him at that particular time. Some media journalists actually wrote about him and all that stuff. Salute to media journalists out there, or those just covering the sport or any sport in general, whether you're a journalist by official degree or not. I don't have a journalism degree. I have a degree in business administration, but I don't have a journalism degree. With that being said, hey, I'm covering the sport. Shout out to Mike Florio, Pro Football Talk, lawyer right there. Been covering it for a long time. He's on a major platform. But that being said, salute to those who highlight the careers of some of these fighters, because guys like Joe Grimm, who we have a video of Joe Grimm on the channel. Matter of fact, need to do a discussion on him. Yeah, they just kind of have sad endings and not a lot of fanfare. As a matter of fact, they said Jack Dempsey at one point, the most popular human on earth. Yeah, when he died, I think it was the 70s. Yeah, they had a wake or something like that, and only a few people were there. Now, I'm not one big in seeing dead bodies or anything, so it's not like I would necessarily be signing up, hey, let me go check out that. But that being said, you get what I'm saying. The fanfare had died down, and you're talking about a guy who was at one point, you can make an argument, the most popular human on the face of Earth. And he was there in the time of even, what's his name? Babe Ruth. You ever heard of him? Yeah, Jack Dempsey was more popular. But you wouldn't have known that when he died. Crazy how that is. Good point there, Dan. Good old John Kelly. Oh, John Kelly. Yeah, Joshua. Hey, keeping me on P's and Q's right there. That's what it is. John Kelly. The great nonpareil Jack Dempsey. Dan, Ezra Charles, one of the 10 greatest pound-for-pound fighters of all time. Certainly, he rates up there, Dan. He certainly rates in that ranking. Hey, it's hard to tell individuals of this time that, I mean, he only won a title at heavyweight, so it's not like he won a title at middleweight, light heavyweight leading up to heavyweight, Dan. So some people in this time might think that's not much to snuff at. But I think you make a good point there, Dan. Certainly. Dan Goddard was shot in the head by police. He was attacking him with a baseball bat while in the hospital, and they let him go, and he went right back with the bat and a bullet in the head. Yeah, crazy. Joe Goddard. Not a name you're going to hear too many people mention right there. Dan mentions him all the time. Actually, another Australian heavyweight who, I guess the best way or the best thing I could say is go look at the resume of Joe Goddard. Google him. That's what I would say. Google Joe Goddard, the Australian heavyweight. And I think that's the best form of appreciation I could give. I just want you to look at his resume and who he fought, and I think you'll gain a greater appreciation of who the man was. Committed to an insane asylum. Yep, certainly. That's what happened with Joe Grimm, essentially. Unfortunate. Then Fernan, soon after retiring, was committed to a insane asylum and died soon. Yeah. Bill Fernan. That's crazy. But certainly it's one of those things that happened. Certainly one of those things that happened. Ezra, another guy that's overrated. Oh, you think overrated, Max Duran? Oh, okay. Underrated. My bad. Okay. I was going to say, well, hold on there, Max. Hold on. I was like, okay, Max. I was like, hey, we're usually on the same page, but hey, it's all good. It's hey, typos happen, certainly. Typos happen. Then started same year. Sugar Ray Ezra was dominant middleweight. Went on to fight World War II. Came back light heavyweight. Then great heavyweight champion. Certainly, he could have been middleweight and light heavyweight champion. He was that good. He didn't get a shot at the title, but he could have been. You can make an argument he was the best in those divisions when he was fighting in those divisions. Craziness. Joshua Woods says Dempsey died in 83. Salute to you there, Joshua Woods, bringing those facts in there. I said 70s or something like that. So 83 is what it was. But the thing with Dempsey is he outlived his era. 87. Not many were allowed to see Dempsey fight. Live when Dempsey died. Yeah, you're right. You're right there, Joshua Woods. So 83. It's crazy. It's crazy to think about that, right? As I was mentioning, not a ton of fanfare at that time. Of course, we respect him, know of him today. More should know of him. The Manasseh Mahler. I don't know. I've said it before, but excuse me, one of my favorite fighters of all time right there, Jack Dempsey. I mean, yeah, there's no way to slice it. One of my favorite fighters of all time. And that's just kind of is what it is. The Manasseh Mahler, Jack Dempsey. I got to do something bigger and deeper on him. You know, I don't like to do videos on those who have a lot of stuff out there, but some fighters, you know, I just have to do it. Some fighters, I have to do it. Of course, there's more stuff out there on certain fighters. I mentioned my favorite boxer being Mike Tyson. Haven't done really a video on Mike Tyson. There's a ton of stuff out there. What more can I say that hasn't been said about Mike Tyson? You could argue Dempsey as well, but man, Dempsey inspired Mike Tyson. That's one of my favorite fighters right there. And hey, I'm not afraid to call a spade where I think he may have lacked in some departments. But keep it real, Dempsey or Gene Tunney outboxed him for 19 rounds. Certainly, Gene Tunney outboxed Jack Dempsey for 19 rounds. Harry Greb gave him hell in sparring. Maybe that's an understatement. Then 8 successful title defenses. Crazy. Max Duran, Rocky Marciano was a guy who would want to be like tough and a guy that does not quit. Certainly. Yeah, Dan's in agreement. Yeah, Rocky was a hell of a fighter right there. Hell of a fighter. Hey, some boxers, fighters, etc., are just kind of polarizing figures in the sport. Rocky Marciano is one of them. And Dan says, I would love to see a Rocky Marciano video. Hey, actually, I have a thumbnail for a Rocky Marciano video, Joshua. But man, there's so many YouTubers that have made Rocky Marciano videos that I don't want to rekindle the same thing. So that's what stopped me from doing it thus far. Though I have an idea of a potential Rocky Marciano video, that I think would be somewhat entertaining and different than what is already out there. But that's the only reason I haven't. I made a Rocky Marciano shorts video, of course, but I usually do those guys late 1800s, early 1900s, and of course Rocky Marciano could fall into that early 1900s realm to a certain degree. But yeah, the only reason I haven't is because there's so much stuff out there and some big channels, bigger channels than I, who've dropped some stuff. So I feel like I need to come correct when I do that Rocky Marciano video. But I have an idea. Of one, I need to make it make sense in terms of the overall layout and construct. I haven't really dove into it in several months, as a matter of fact. I actually already started some aspects of it, and I have the thumbnail, as I mentioned, which I think is the best thumbnail on Rocky Marciano that will be out there on YouTube. But I just need to dive into it a bit more there, Joshua. But yeah, maybe I need to open that up again. But I have an idea for something that wouldn't be, just tapping into the same things. And luckily we have a lot of good film on Rocky Marciano. So that's the thing too, some of those guys, or those channels, I should say, that have created Rocky Marciano stuff, they use a lot of the footage, and that's all fine and well. So we have a good deal of footage of him. A lot of the individuals I do videos on, for the most part, either don't have any footage and barely have pictures for some of them, or a limited amount of video. And so that's one of the things I try to think about as well. And certainly some people don't know about some of these individuals, and some people are indifferent because of the fact that they don't have footage of them. Because, there are those out there who say they don't think a fighter is good, or they can't determine how good a fighter is because they haven't seen any footage of them. So you have some people like that, though, and I don't think. I think it's hard to convince some people, especially if they want to be pretty steadfast in that stance, that if I haven't seen them, they weren't good. Get that a lot with Harry Greb. So yeah, therefore they may not want to check out some of the videos I've done on some of these fighters just because there's no video on them, But it is what it is. That doesn't mean they weren't great fighters, because in most cases they were. And the stories are pretty amazing, especially compared to some of these fighters of today. Of course, a lot of things, the foundation has been laid for these fighters of today. So that's something you need to think about right there, for those who tend to skip past the fighters of the past. No pun intended. Skip past the fighters of the past. But the foundation was laid. So, I mean, you could argue I'm beating a dead horse, but time will tell. Joshua Woods, Marciano did have lots of people mourn him when he died. His funeral was huge. Yeah, certainly it was there. Yeah, I know that I've seen some little footage relating to such there. I haven't dove into it, but I know what you're saying there, Woods, Joshua. So yeah, tragic circumstances, of course, always sad in situations like that. Died too young, far too young for sure. Max Duran says Archie Moore shook his head when Rocky knocked him down. He was probably like, damn, this guy won't stop. Most certainly there. And we know Archie's as tough as they come. Yeah, he was just like, damn, like, what more can I do? I've hit him with everything. He just will not stop coming forward. I mean, hey, that was the most part for pretty much the majority of all who Marciano fought. I mean, look at the way he ended Joe Louis. Yeah, after that, hey, I respect Joe Louis for not lacing him up again after that, because when you go out like that, yeah, you need to hang him up for sure. Dan said day before his 46th B-Day. Yeah, that's crazy. Crazy. 46. That's crazy. That's crazy right there. Man, so tragic. Tragic circumstances. That's exactly what he said too, Max. Yeah. Dan said, Archie said soon in the fight he realized this guy too strong, too tough. Archie really wanted to train. Well, yeah, you really wanted to train hard. Yeah, Archie, arguably the greatest older fighter the sport has ever seen. Of course, George Foreman did some great things. Bernard Hopkins, we've seen him do some great things. But Archie Moore, then there's some others out there as well. But Archie Moore, certainly, I regard him as the greatest older fighter the sport has seen. Think about what he was able to do post 40, or we can just say post 30, you know, because, hey, boxing, better believe it's a young man's sport from a physical standpoint. So, man, just think about Archie Moore saying that almost 8 years later fought Ali. Yeah, what I'm getting into right there, Dan. Crazy. Fought Ali 8 years later. He fought Marciano. He fought Ali. I mean, that speaks for itself, really. Dan the historian, yes, sir. Yeah, right there, Max. Certainly fought again for a title KO by Patterson. Yeah, that's crazy. It's crazy just thinking about it. Yeah, Archie Moore, man, he's one of the 10 greatest fighters of all time. As far as I'm concerned, Archie Moore is one of those. I mean, you look at what he was able to do. I mean, and he had a long road before you even get into that point of fighting for titles. Just insane. Yeah, I'm with you there. Some people have called me a historian there. I'm flattered by it, but yeah, no. I'm just kind of looking into some stuff and kind of sharing what I found out about. Joshua Wood said, I did joke on Corbett video when you got to Jeffrey's fight when pics of the fight show Corbett in his famous thumb, but you had to be short. That is funny right there. Hey, that is one. I get that anytime. I showed my partner here, and that's the first thing she pointed out. It is pretty crazy. I mean, Jim could have had some damn underwear or something on. I'm guessing he just went raw in the raw with the jock strap or the cup, you know. I don't know why on earth he felt the need to do that. I feel like he could have had underwear or something on there, Joshua Woods. Billy Papke, if you see when he fought Stanley Ketchel, there's video out there, similar situation, but he had some underwear on. I don't know what Corbett was thinking, but he was an eccentric character. He should have had something on. Yeah, we didn't need all that on film. That was supposed to be PG-13. He made it R-rated. Come on now, Corbett. But Joshua, hey, you had me crackling up real life right there when you left that comment there. I know what you're talking about. That is funny. Shout out to Jim Corbett. The first boxer to be sponsored by Speedo. This thing. Oh my goodness. This craziness. Craziness. Max Duran, I've been getting better with my boxing history. I'm good from the 50s, 80s, but 86 got me in 1800, 1910. Hey, salute to you, Max Duran. Hey, I don't know a lot about the from the 50s up. Well, I know a lot about of course the last, since the 2000s on. Yeah, of course, I've been watching it then. I would say even 2010 onward, even more so in terms of what's going on now. But hey, I'm still learning and catching up on some of the stuff from the 90s, 80s, 70s, 60s, 50s, heck, even 40s, 30s. There were some great fighters that were back then, so there's so much stuff out there, such a story and deep history. Man, it's just hard to know everything. Certainly it's hard to know everything there, Max. So hey, we're in a similar boat. This I tend to lean more towards this era. That's why I know a bit more about this era, because that's what I read more of. But certainly, there's some other areas I need to become more fond of. 70s especially. I know about the great heavyweights of the 70s. But that being said, I don't know about all of them. Shout out to Bruce Gass. He's always putting on some of these videos from some of the 70s era. He came up in that era, and of course up until now. So hey, I'm always learning stuff too, seeing some fights I hadn't seen. But certainly I love the 1800s, early 1900s. I would say late 1800s. I don't know a ton about the bare-knuckle era, though I know some of the names, and I have an interest in it, of course. But with Marcus of Queensberry rules in itself, there's just so much tied to it that, yeah, there's only so much you can tackle in a day, or you know what I'm saying, or in a 24-hour period, that is. Yeah, certainly there, Max. Take notes, Mayweather. Hey, Mayweather, yeah, he's one of my favorite fighters coming up, certainly. And as I continue to dive into the history that put more perspective on things, I think, yeah, certainly great fighter, but yeah, I don't think he's the greatest fighter as some thinks, but certainly, hey, one of the great welterweights the sport has seen. But man, I have too much of a respect and love for the history to deem TBE, if you know what I mean. Then that Archie awesome fight with Ivan Durrell was 5 years after Marciano. Wow, that's crazy. That's crazy when you throw that in there. But man, that is crazy. That was after Marciano. Dan, yeah, that's crazy stuff right there. Certainly crazy. And if you haven't seen that Archie Moore Ivan Durrell fight, for you watching on replay in here right now, and you haven't seen it, I say drop everything, leave from this stream if you need to. Matter of fact, yeah, leave from this stream and go watch. It's on YouTube. Archie Moore versus Ivan Durrell. I think nothing speaks more Archie Moore than that fight. That is the fight. If you want to summarize the type of fighter that Archie Moore was, Archie Moore versus Ivan Durrell. Go watch that now. I would say. Maybe check out Smooth Legends. That's a channel they redo I'm assuming he, but fixing the frame rate and all that stuff, you get HD versions of these fights. He probably has that on there. I've always enjoyed that channel, checking out some of the videos that have been redone. It's almost like HD. So Ivan Durrell, if I could recommend any Archie Moore fight, that would be the one. Ivan Durrell versus Archie Moore, because I think you see what Archie Moore is truly made of. He went on to be a trainer as well. Seemingly just a great guy to just talk boxing with. I've seen some interviews of him in older age and all that. There's some stuff out there. I think ESPN was doing some stuff. Those covering boxing during that period. Like late 80s, 90s. I think he died in the 90s. And worth checking out. A lot like Willie Pep, who I've mentioned before. Ladies weren't allowed. Oh, yeah. Yeah, right. And that happened oftentimes right there. Yeah, ladies weren't allowed in some of those things. Always, hey, same here. Keeps me on my toes as well. Richard Darkey Richardson was a great black fighter in Australia, but he was from Johnson County, Maryland. Oh, right, cool. I'm in DC. I used to live in Maryland, as a matter of fact. Interesting. I had to look at him. Richard Darkey Richardson. Wonder what the Darkey comes from. I get it. Certainly the times, I'd imagine. Richard Darkey Richardson. Good stuff, Dan. I'm going to check him out. Oh, Dick Richardson. He was Welsh. Oh, cool. Hey, put me on game there. I didn't know of him, Dad. I'm going to check him out now. They were woke. No, certainly. Great state in. Buffalo Costello from Buffalo, NY. My own. Oh, yeah, it is Buffalo fighting town right there. That's where Jimmy Slattery is from, right? He's from New York. If I'm not mistaken, I think he's from New York. Maybe Buffalo. I could be wrong. He's from somewhere, I feel like near there. Somewhere in that area, right? Martin Buffalo Costello from Buffalo, NY, my hometown. He went to Australia to fight. Fought Prime Peter Jackson 3 times. Never lost. He won in 2 draws. Okay, good stuff. Martin Buffalo Costello. Yeah, man, hey, it was tough sledding there in Australia, especially early on for Peter Jackson. He matured into a great fighter, but starting out, hey, he went up against some tough competition, probably earlier than he probably should have. Or I'm sure he thought that he was going to be able to handle it, but hey, some of those guys are just veterans of the sport, and they gave him that work. Max Duran says, got this new COVID variant going on again in Long Beach. Oh, yeah, I've heard about that. Oh, no, you got it again. Oh, no, Max. Get well there, Max. Get well. Yeah, I've heard about it for sure. Yeah, they've been talking about it. I know they're supposed to be sending out these little testing kits and all that stuff, which, hey, I think is a good thing. So certainly get well there. You never know. Yeah, you never know. So get well there, Max, for sure. Dan said no, but Costello stayed there fighting all those Australians. Okay, good. Okay, gotcha there, Max. Okay, good to go. Yeah, crazy out here. Yeah, I've heard about the variant. Gotten a little rough here. You know, we've kind of moved past it for the most part. So yeah, interesting stuff. Interesting, but yeah, man. C.A.C, I know we've gone on. We've talked about all different types of fighters in history at this point, but the great C.A.C. Smith, subject of the video, of course. Hey, if you don't know about him, hopefully you learned a little bit something about him. We've been here 2 hours plus, almost 2 hours and 30 minutes. Time to wrap this thing up. But I guess I can say that, I hope you enjoyed what we discussed on C.A.C. Smith. We didn't dive into every little thing as mentioned, but enough for you to get it kind of a semblance of him. I showed you a portion of the video, of course. I showed you a portion of the video. And also there's another video I have out there on the channel. It's a C.A.C. Smith, I call it career video. This is one of the earlier videos. So it doesn't really dive into everything, and it doesn't dive deep into all of the fights, but it does highlight some of his top challenges in his career. So check that out. Check out the John L. Sullivan video, which is one of the more recent, I think the second most recent video on the channel as far as long form video content. That will give you the totality of the whole John L. Sullivan potential matchups, which include C.A.C. Smith, as well as some other names there that would have made for excellent fights with John L. Sullivan. So C.A.C. Smith, first world colored heavyweight champion, excellent fighter. In an era, in the era there in the 70s, had to build his way up. In the 80s, competition continued to get tougher and tougher. Then the 90s, 1890s, that is, hey, just continuing to rise. And it would continue on at all-time highs. There's great fighters during that period in general. So, man, certainly something worth noting. But hey, I appreciate everyone being in here. Max Rand says, see you later. Stay safe out here, guys. Hey, appreciate you, Max. You too. Hey, stay safe out there, Max, Dan, etc. who's been in the mix. Max representing that LBC. So much drama in the LBC. It's kind of hard being Snoop D-O double G. That's just something I know right there. But salute to you there, Max. Salute to you, Dan. All that have dropped in. I mean, so many dropped in. Joshua Woods. Appreciate you. It's been a minute, Joshua. Appreciate you being in here. Who else dropped in here? So many folks dropped in. So many. Intro to artists. Alexander Campbell was in for a minute. Time for the kickback. Random acoustic thoughts. The Boz was in here. Joseph Phoenix in here. Flat Boxing. Rodolfo Rivera Jr. showed up in the mix here. Bruce Gas, Boxing Jazz, and more. Man, so many people came by. Emberly Grace. Even though Emberly, I know you're trying to get me to get on some kind of TikTok promotion program. It's not happening, but I salute you for dropping in here, bro. Miter Span, the man. Appreciate you, Miter. Great having you in here, no doubt, as well. Minute. Hey, got to come around more, Miter. As I mentioned, I'm going to hit you up for sure. The LBC. Yes, sir. Yes, sir, there, Max. I know about that. Know about that right there. Good stuff, no doubt. But yeah, and salute to you, Dan, as always. Hey, always great sharing these nuggets here, Dan. Appreciate you for sure. Good night and God bless everyone. Dan sends that regards to all. So, hey, appreciate you all. We'll be back. I'm going to set something up maybe Wednesday Wednesday and then another day. But I think, or it could be Tuesday, but you never know. But we're going to talk about some other boxers because this history is some good stuff. Master Run says, God bless everyone. Stay safe. Stay safe, all. Appreciate you being here. For everyone that came by, for everyone checking it out on the replay, salute to you all. Salute to you, Nick Hammer. I know you'll probably be checking this joint out. Good night from Joshua Woods. Salute to you, Joshua Woods, as well. Everyone have a good one. Hey, you know where I'm at.